The night air over Jerusalem was soft and fragrant with olive and myrtle. Within the royal chamber, a boy knelt beside an aged man's bed, the last flicker of a torch dancing across the carved cedar walls. King David, the poet-warrior who had sung to his God under shepherd stars and conquered kingdoms with harp and sword alike, breathed his final instructions. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of legacy. "Be strong, my son," he whispered. "Keep faith. Build what I could not." Outside, the city slept beneath the pale moon. Tomorrow, the boy named Solomon would wear a crown. The world would call him wise, but wisdom, he did not yet know, is bought in the slow fire of life itself. So begins the story of Solomon, Prince of Peace, son of David, and heir to an age unlike any before it. His name would echo for centuries through scripture, song, and legend. His life would bind together myth and memory, prophecy and politics. His was the story of gold and glory, of the temple and the heart, of a man who sought to understand all things under the sun and found that even wisdom has its shadow. At the dawn of his reign, Israel stood at a fragile crossroad. The kingdom David had carved from tribal dust was strong but weary. The Philistines had fallen, the Canaanite cities subdued, yet beneath the triumph lay old rivalries between Judah and the northern tribes, between priest and warrior, prophet and king. The throne Solomon inherited gleamed with power, but trembled with expectation. He was not the eldest son. That honour had belonged to Adonijah, proud and ambitious, who had sought to claim the crown before David's death. But Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, had moved swiftly, securing the aged king's blessing for the younger, quieter son. Thus, Solomon's first day as ruler began not with celebration but with tension, a test of both wisdom and resolve. Adonijah's rebellion was short-lived but bloody. Solomon ordered him shown mercy once, then struck down when the prince tested that mercy again. It was a grim introduction to power, and perhaps a lesson that peace must sometimes be guarded by the sword. He cleansed his court of conspirators, the last echoes of David's turbulent years fading into silence. In those early days, the young king often withdrew to the sacred hills outside Jerusalem. There, amid the wind and dust, he offered sacrifice at Gibeon, the ancient high place where the Ark of the Covenant had once rested. One night, as the smoke of offering curled into the heavens, sleep overtook him. And in that sleep came a vision. He saw himself standing before the Eternal, whose voice filled the air like the sound of deep waters. "Ask what I shall give you," said the divine presence. It was no dream of riches or conquest. It was a summons to the heart. Solomon bowed his head. "I am but a little child," he said. "I know not how to go out or come in. Your servant stands among your people, a great people, too numerous to count. Give therefore to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil." The silence that followed was vast and full of light. Then came the voice again, gentle and pleased. "Because you have asked for this, and not for long life, nor riches, nor vengeance, behold, I give you a wise and understanding heart, and I give you also what you have not asked, both wealth and honour, so that none shall equal you among kings." When Solomon awoke, the dawn burned red above the hills of Judah. The air was cool and sharp. The world felt newly made. He returned to Jerusalem filled with quiet awe. That morning he ordered a great feast in the temple courtyard, not for his own glory, but in gratitude to the unseen hand that had touched his mind. From that day, the people whispered that the Spirit of the Lord walked with their king. Word of his vision spread across the land, through the vineyards of Ephraim and the olive groves of Hebron. Farmers and priests alike took comfort in the promise that Israel would be ruled not by war or pride, but by understanding. The young ruler began his reign with reforms. He reorganized the courts, appointed just officials over each tribe, and called for peace among the warring clans. His approach was patient, deliberate, a stark contrast to his father's tempestuous rule. In the quiet corridors of power, Solomon listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words fell like measured rain, nourishing and exact. Yet beneath the calm, he was learning the rhythm of power, the uneasy balance between justice and mercy, order and freedom. He knew that a king must not only command but understand the hearts of men. And so, in the days that followed, he began to walk the streets of Jerusalem in disguise, listening to merchants, beggars, and craftsmen as they spoke of their lives. From their stories, he learned more than from all the scrolls in his libraries. That wisdom, if it was to endure, must be rooted in compassion. But the peace he sought would not come easily. Beyond the borders of his land, the ancient world stirred. To the south, Egypt watched with wary eyes, its pharaohs remembering the power David once wielded. To the north, the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon thrived on trade and cunning diplomacy. Across the desert, the kingdoms of Moab and Edom lingered like ghosts, nursing grudges and memories. The world around Solomon was vast and restless, and his fledgling rule could be easily broken if he faltered. Still, in the quiet of his private chambers, the young king dreamed of something greater than survival. He envisioned an Israel united not by conquest, but by faith, a realm that would shine as a beacon of order and wisdom to all nations. For every man beneath his vine and fig tree, he once said, there shall be peace. To achieve this, he began to strengthen ties beyond the sword. He sent envoys to Egypt, sealing peace with the marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, a union that startled his people but secured his southern flank. To the north, he opened trade with Hiram, king of Tyre, whose cedar forests and shipwrights would one day help raise the temple of the Lord. These were the foundations of what would become Israel's golden age, alliances of faith and commerce, of diplomacy and art. Jerusalem, once a fortress of stone, began to hum with life. Traders from Arabia, scribes from Tyre, ambassadors from Sheba. In the heart of the city, the palace grew, not as a monument to himself, but as the center of an idea, that wisdom and peace could rule the world more firmly than war ever could. Sometimes, in the cool of the evening, Solomon would stand upon the palace balcony and look toward the hills where his father once hid from Saul. The sky would darken, the stars revealing themselves like thoughts scattered across eternity, and he would feel the weight of the promise given at Gibeon that he was to be a vessel of understanding, a bridge between heaven and earth. But beneath the stillness, destiny was already at work. The boy who had asked for wisdom would one day find that knowledge is not peace, and that even the wisest hearts are bound by the frailty of men. For every kingdom built upon understanding, there must come the test of whether it can endure the passions that gave it birth. And thus, the era of Solomon truly began with hope like sunrise over the hills of Zion, soft and golden, yet shadowed by the mysteries that wisdom can never quite dispel, the crown of peace. In the days that followed his divine vision at Gibeon, Solomon's reign began to take form not as the storm his father had lived by, but as a calm that gathered strength in silence. His hand was light but steady, his gaze far-reaching. The nation that had once trembled under David's wars now exhaled, feeling the first taste of stability in generations. Fields once trampled by armies turned green again. Shepherds led their flocks in peace beneath skies that seemed newly washed. The trumpet of war was replaced by the hum of industry, by laughter in vineyards, by the slow music of the plough. Solomon understood something few rulers ever did, that true empire begins not in conquest, but in cohesion. He walked the boundary lines of his inheritance and saw that a kingdom, no matter how vast, is only as strong as the peace within it. The tribes of Israel, Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, had long histories of rivalry and pride. Their union under David had been a fragile miracle. To preserve it, Solomon would need more than soldiers. He would need unity born of trust. And so, He set out to weave the people together through structure and purpose. His first act of wisdom was administrative, not divine. He divided the realm into 12 districts, each governed by a trusted overseer responsible for tribute and provision to the royal court. No longer would tribal boundaries dictate allegiance. The kingdom itself would be the measure of loyalty. It was a small stroke of genius, quiet, almost invisible, but it turned 12 competing tribes into 12 arteries feeding the same heart. The new system freed the people from endless disputes over borders and taxes, and for the first time, Jerusalem stood as the unchallenged center of the land. It gleamed in the sunlight, a city of marble, cedar, and gold, ringed by gardens and towers. Craftsmen from Sidon shaped its palaces. Hebrew builders raised its walls stone by stone. Beneath its gates, merchants brought grain from the north, olive oil from the hills, copper from Edom, and horses from Egypt. It was becoming not merely the capital of a kingdom, but the symbol of a civilization at peace. Solomon often walked the city in the early morning, wrapped in simple linen, before the courtly day began. He listened to the pulse of his creation, the bleating of animals, the shouts of merchants, the laughter of children playing near the aqueducts. He found in it the harmony of his dreams. Peace, he thought, is the breath of God moving through men. Yet even he knew that peace, if left untended, could grow soft and complacent. He worked tirelessly, not as a conqueror but as a gardener, pruning, planting, and guiding the branches of his people. The alliances he formed during this period became the foundation of his power. To the south, his marriage to Pharaoh's daughter secured Egypt's respect and ensured that the armies along the Nile would never again march northward. To the west, he strengthened friendship with King Hiram of Tyre, the Phoenician whose ships ruled the Mediterranean. Hiram admired Solomon's intellect, calling him the Sage of Zion. Between them flowed an alliance of timber, stone, and trade. Lebanon's cedars for Israel's grain and copper, sailors for merchants, craftsmen for visionaries. Together they planned projects that would outlive both men fortresses along the trade routes, cities at the edge of the desert, ports that opened Israel's horizons to the sea. Ships of Tarshish, crewed by Tyrians and Hebrews alike, began to sail beyond the Red Sea, their white sails like wings against the horizon. From distant lands they brought ivory, peacocks, gold, and stories that would one day become parables in the mouth of the wise king. While the world admired his diplomacy, Solomon's greatest conquest was inward. He began to codify justice not as the will of the ruler, but as the reflection of divine order. The courts of Israel were rebuilt, their judges trained to act not for favor or tribe, but for righteousness. It was during these reforms that the people first began to call him Shlomo HaChakam, Solomon the Wise. His fame spread to Damascus, Nineveh, even to the oases of Arabia. Traders spoke of him not as a warrior king, but as one who ruled with words sharper than swords. In the halls of his palace, scribes wrote down his sayings, short, clear jewels of thought that glimmered with truth. "Better is a little with righteousness," he once said, "than great revenues without justice." These words were repeated by shepherds at campfires, by merchants at dawn, by mothers teaching their children. Slowly, the voice of the king became the conscience of the nation. Yet Solomon's peace was not passive. Beneath the quiet industry of his reign, vast projects moved like tides beneath still waters. Armies were reorganized and equipped, not for conquest but for deterrence. Walls were strengthened, chariots forged. The king knew well that peace endures only when it is prepared for war. To secure trade routes, he fortified cities like Hazor and Megiddo, their gates vast enough for royal processions and caravans of wealth. These acts, though defensive, drew murmurs from his counselors. "You build as though expecting the storms," one said. Solomon's eyes, distant and unreadable, turned toward the desert. "The wise man," he replied, "builds his house before the rain." the wealth of Israel began to multiply beyond anything the tribes had ever known. Tribute from neighboring lands filled the treasury: silver, spices, and fine textiles. In Jerusalem's markets, the air smelled of frankincense and cedar resin, of myrrh and wool. The streets gleamed with bronze lamps that burned long into the night. Visitors from Egypt and Phoenicia wrote of the city as a wonder, a place where learning, architecture, and commerce blended into one living testament of prosperity. Solomon's palace itself became the emblem of his vision. Designed not for indulgence but for meaning, it stretched across terraces that overlooked the valley below. Courtyards brimmed with fountains and flowering pomegranates. Columns of white limestone rose like harp strings against the sky, catching the light of dawn. At its heart stood the Hall of Judgment, a vast chamber lined with cedar and overlaid with gold leaf, where the king sat upon his ivory throne. Lions of sculpted gold guarded the steps, symbolizing both strength and restraint. There he heard the pleas of his people. The famous case of the two women, each claiming to be the mother of the same infant, was only the first of many. His judgment, simple yet profound, spread across the world as proof of divine insight. He did not merely solve disputes, he unraveled the hearts behind them. His ability to see truth in paradox became legend. Foreign envoys watched in wonder as he dispensed justice with the serenity of a priest and the authority of a monarch. "Behold," one Babylonian scribe wrote, "a ruler who commands without bloodshed, whose word alone builds and binds." Solomon's wisdom, though divine in origin, was human in practice. He sought knowledge not only from priests and prophets, but from craftsmen, traders, and healers. He collected proverbs from shepherds, riddles from merchants, parables from travelers. Knowledge to him was sacred no matter where it bloomed. He ordered scribes to record the sayings of the people, believing that truth is a river with many springs. In time, his curiosity extended beyond the human realm. He studied the flight of birds, the whisper of trees, the patterns of stars. He saw in nature the reflection of the same laws that governed kings and nations, the symmetry of cause and effect, the balance between giving and taking. "The ant," he said once, "has no ruler, yet she stores her food in summer and is wise." Such observations would fill scrolls of learning, shaping generations who would see in Solomon not just a monarch, but a philosopher king. And yet, in all his glory, there remained within him a subtle ache, a restlessness that no peace could soothe. He would sometimes retreat to the heights above the city and look toward the sea, where the horizon dissolved into mist. In those moments, he felt the paradox of his gift, that the more he knew, the deeper the mystery became. Wisdom had given him peace, but it had also opened his eyes to the fragility of all things. His nights were long and silent, spent in thought. He would write or dictate verses to his scribes, words that danced between devotion and melancholy. "To everything there is a season," he murmured once. "A time to be born and a time to die. A time to build and a time to break down." It was as though, even at the height of his triumph, he could already sense the shadow that wisdom always casts the knowledge that no golden age can last forever. Still, the crown of peace held firm. Years passed, and the land prospered. From Dan to Beersheba, from the mountains to the sea, the people of Israel lived each beneath his vine and his fig tree, as the old promise said. Trade routes pulsed like living veins, carrying silver from Tarshish, gold from Ophir, horses from Egypt, cedar from Lebanon. The temple was not yet built, but the plans were forming in his mind, a sanctuary that would outshine all others, a dwelling for the presence that had once walked with Moses. At the heart of it all, Solomon's reign seemed an unbroken hymn, steady, calm, wise. Foreign kings sent gifts, poets sang his praises, and prophets, for the moment, were silent. The world had found balance under his rule. But peace, even divine peace, has a price. Beneath the prosperity lay seeds of dependency, wealth that drew envy, luxury that softened discipline, alliances that tangled faith with foreign gods. The crown of peace gleamed brightly, but its gold was thin, and beneath it waited the weight of temptation. For now, however, the land dreamed. The rivers ran full, the harvests were rich, and the people looked to Solomon as though he were more than mortal. In his stillness, in his measured gaze, they saw the promise of heaven on earth. And so, as the sun set over Jerusalem's golden roofs and the cedar shadows deepened, the king sat in silence upon his throne, watching the light fade and the stars rise. The world was at peace, and for a time it seemed that such peace might endure forever. The judgment of Solomon. The court of the king was hushed, the air thick with incense and the faint scent of cedar smoke. From the high windows of the hall of judgment, sunlight poured in narrow beams, catching motes of dust that hung like threads of gold. The crowd pressed close to the marble pillars, their whispers fading into reverent silence. Upon the ivory throne sat Solomon, crowned yet serene, his eyes calm as still water. The people had come to witness his wisdom, a phrase now spoken as though it were a kind of miracle. Before him stood two women, each dishevelled and trembling, clutching the same infant. The child wailed softly, unaware that his life had become the axis upon which justice itself would turn. One woman stepped forward. "My lord, this woman and I dwell in one house," she said, her voice shaking. "And we bore children, she and I. On the third night after my delivery, her son died. She rose in the night and took my living child from my side while I slept, and laid her dead son in my bosom. When I rose to nurse him at dawn, behold, he was dead. But when I looked closer, I knew it was not my son." The second woman's eyes flared with indignation. "It is false. The living child is mine, and the dead is hers." Their cries overlapped, rising and falling like the sea. The hall filled with their desperation, the echo of grief and accusation twisting through the columns. Even the guards looked uncertain. Then Solomon raised his hand, and the air stilled. His gaze moved between the two mothers, not sharp, but searching, as though peering into a fire and seeing its reflection in the eyes of those who warmed themselves by it. "Bring me a sword," he said. The words cut through the silence like thunder. A soldier hesitated, then obeyed. The metal flashed in the light as it was brought before the throne. "Divide the living child in two," the king said evenly, "and give half to the one and half to the other. Thanks for watching." A gasp rippled through the hall. The women froze, then one of them cried out, her body folding as if struck. "No, my lord, give her the child only, do not slay it." The other stood still, lips pressed tight. "It shall be neither mine nor hers," she said coldly. "Divide it." And Solomon rose, his eyes soft but unyielding. "Give the living child to the first woman," he said, "for she is the mother." The hall erupted not in applause, but in awe. For in a single moment, the king had revealed not only the truth, but the heart behind it. It was not cunning that guided his judgment, nor mere logic, but compassion, sharpened by understanding. Word of the trial spread like fire through Israel and beyond. From that day, all who heard it knew that the spirit of divine wisdom truly rested upon him. But the story was more than legend. It became a symbol of the kind of ruler Solomon sought to be, one who ruled not by decree, but by discernment. He understood that justice was not merely the law's edge, but the balance between mercy and truth. That trial, simple though it seemed, marked the dawn of a new age, when wisdom itself became the measure of power. In the months that followed, Solomon's court became a living heart of learning. Scribes recorded his judgments, artisans decorated the chambers with carved lilies and cherubim, and the scent of incense mingled with the rustle of scrolls. Day after day, people came from all corners of the land, farmers disputing boundaries, merchants quarrelling over debts, priests seeking interpretation of sacred law. Solomon heard them all. He listened with the patience of one who understood that every conflict is a reflection of the same human struggle: pride and fear, love and loss, hope and betrayal. His words were measured, deliberate. Often he would let silence stretch before he answered, as though allowing truth itself to rise to the surface, like oil upon water. He spoke softly but carried the weight of conviction. His presence calmed tempers and turned anger into reflection. Soon, even his enemies found it hard to hate him. His understanding disarmed resentment. "He sees not only what we do," one elder remarked, "but why we do it." And yet, Solomon's gift was more than perception. He possessed a rare balanced intellect tempered by empathy, authority softened by humility. When he rendered judgment, it felt not like command but revelation. Each verdict carried the rhythm of poetry, the clarity of scripture, and the precision of law. From such wisdom grew reputation, and from reputation, reverence. Delegations from other lands began to arrive: emissaries from Moab, envoys from Tyre, ambassadors from Arabia. They came bearing tribute and questions, testing his mind with riddles, seeking alliances sealed by wisdom rather than warfare. Solomon welcomed them all. His court became a mosaic of languages and customs, the hum of many worlds converging under the roof of Jerusalem. The palace halls rang with the sound of translators, merchants, musicians, and scholars. Knowledge flowed freely between them: astronomy from Babylon, medicine from Egypt, poetry from Phoenicia. He absorbed it all, weaving what he learned into his own growing philosophy, that the world was one vast design, each nation a thread in a tapestry only the wise could see whole. To him, even the faith of strangers held echoes of divine order. "Wisdom," he once said, "is the heritage of all who seek it." But not all in Israel approved of this openness. The old priests of Shiloh muttered that foreign tongues brought foreign gods. To them, the court was becoming too worldly, too tolerant of ideas beyond the covenant. Solomon, however, believed that understanding others did not weaken faith, it deepened it. He sought to know the world that God had made, not to defy it, but to honour it more completely. His mind was restless, luminous. At night, by lamplight, he would walk the colonnades of his palace and speak softly to the stars. He studied their courses and recorded their patterns, believing that every movement in heaven mirrored the order of life below. He wrote treatises on nature, on plants and beasts, on wind and water, declaring that wisdom dwelt not only in the temple but in every living thing. This fascination with creation led to a quiet revolution in Jerusalem. Schools of scribes and scholars sprang up under royal patronage. Young men studied languages, arithmetic, astronomy, law. Women, too, in rare moments, were permitted to learn poetry and healing arts in the palace gardens. For Solomon believed that wisdom should not be hoarded like gold, but sown like seed. The book of Proverbs, later attributed to his hand, began to take shape in this fertile age. His sayings flowed like streams from a single mountain spring. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Each line carried the rhythm of lived experience. Simple enough for shepherds, profound enough for kings. These proverbs spread through the land, stitched into memory and song. They were copied onto parchment, carved into wood, whispered from mother to child. A culture was forming, one not merely of faith, but of reflection. Yet even as he nurtured the soul of his people, Solomon did not forget the power of image. His temple plans were growing, vast and intricate. He envisioned a house, not for his own glory, but for the eternal, a dwelling where heaven and earth might meet. To prepare, he gathered craftsmen from every land, stones from quarries of Jerusalem, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Ophir. In the shadow of this great project, his court flourished in splendor. Visitors described Jerusalem as a city of song and light, where the very air seemed touched by reverence. The people prospered, their faith strong, their king beloved. But beneath the perfection lay the faint stirrings of a truth Solomon could not escape. Wisdom brings understanding, but also sorrow. He began to sense that to see too clearly is to glimpse the fragility of all things. Sometimes, late at night, he would stand on the palace roof, the wind moving through his robe like a whisper. He would look toward the hills where shepherd fires burned faintly, and he would think of his father, David, the warrior poet, who had ruled through passion, who had lived by the sword but died with a song. Solomon's own reign was the opposite. Peace instead of conquest, reason instead of emotion. Yet he wondered which had truly known the heart of man better, the father who fought or the son who understood. His reflection deepened his solitude, but also his greatness. For out of that solitude grew the depth that the world came to revere, a wisdom that did not merely solve problems but spoke to the soul of existence itself. As the years unfolded, Solomon's name became synonymous with truth. Songs were sung in the marketplaces. Pilgrims came to kneel before his temple's foundations. Even distant rulers invoked his counsel when judging their own disputes. In this season of light, the world seemed balanced upon a single mind, a king whose every word carried the gravity of eternity. Yet even as he built a legacy of justice and insight, the horizon of his story was darkening. For wisdom, as the old poets warned, does not guard the heart from desire, and in the glittering courts of peace, temptation was already finding its voice. The architect of God, the morning mist drifted across the hills of Jerusalem like the breath of something ancient. From the terraces of his palace, Solomon looked out over the city that his father had conquered, the city he was now transforming into a monument of faith and beauty. Beneath the still air, masons were already at work, the ring of chisel against stone rising like a hymn. Dust hung over the Mount of Moriah, the sacred height where Abraham had once bound his son, and where, now, the king would build a temple worthy of the eternal. It had begun with a whisper in Solomon's mind, a dream that returned each night more vividly. His father, David, had long desired to build a dwelling for the Ark of the Covenant, but the Lord had denied him. David had shed too much blood. The task, the voice had said, would fall to his son, a man of peace, not war. Solomon never forgot that inheritance. The temple would not merely be a building, it would be the symbol of his reign, the bridge between the human and the divine, between dust and glory. He summoned his council and laid out the vision. "It shall be the house of the Lord," he said, "built not of conquest, but of offering." The plans were unlike anything Israel had ever seen. He would not rely only on his own artisans. From Tyre, his ally Hiram sent cedar logs and skilled builders. From Egypt came goldsmiths and metalworkers. From the mountains of Lebanon, stonemasons hewn from generations of craft. Solomon opened Israel's borders not to armies, but to craftsmen, creating a coalition of skill and devotion. Tens of thousands of men laboured in shifts. 70,000 burden bearers, 80,000 hewers of stone, and 3,000 overseers. In quarries deep beneath Jerusalem, the sound of hammer and pick echoed through the dark, shaping blocks of limestone so massive they would seem eternal. No iron tool was heard upon the mount itself, for the law forbade the sound of warlike metal in the house of peace. Instead, each stone was cut and finished, far from the temple site, brought up the hill in silence, and fitted so precisely that one might believe they had been placed there by divine hand. As months turned to years, the structure rose, columns of white stone glowing in the sunlight, overlaid with carved lilies and palms, cherubim and fruit. The scent of cedar filled the air, mingling with incense from the morning sacrifices. Artisans from Tyre gilded the beams with pure gold, their brushes gliding over surfaces so smooth they reflected the faces of those who gazed upon them. The entrance gleamed with bronze doors 20 cubits high, engraved with vines and open flowers. The inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, was panelled entirely in gold, its walls adorned with carved cherubim whose wings stretched from wall to wall. In that inner chamber no window opened to the sun, for its light would come only from the presence of God. Outside, 2 colossal pillars stood before the porch, one named Jachin, he shall establish, and the other Boaz, in him is strength. These names, carved in the king's own hand, symbolized the balance he sought: permanence and power, faith and understanding. 7 years the labor continued. Caravans brought treasures from distant lands, onyx and sapphire, fine linen, and gold dust from Ophir. Solomon himself walked the site daily, speaking with builders, inspecting the design, offering prayers of gratitude. To him, the temple was not an act of pride but of devotion, a fulfillment of his father's dream and the covenant of his people. When the day of dedication came, the city thrummed with reverence. From the gate of the palace, the Ark of the Covenant, that sacred chest of acacia wood, overlaid with gold, bearing the tablets of the law, was lifted upon the shoulders of the Levites. They moved slowly, chanting psalms as they ascended Mount Moriah. Trumpets sounded. Thousands of priests and musicians filled the air with the clash of cymbals, the wail of horns, the deep pulse of drums. The ark was brought into the Holy of Holies, and when the priests withdrew, a cloud descended upon the temple, thick, luminous, unearthly. The people fell to their knees, for the glory of the Lord filled the house. Solomon stood upon a bronze platform before the altar, raised his hands to the sky, and prayed, "Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you, in heaven above or on earth beneath. You keep covenant and show mercy to your servants who walk before you. Behold, the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet have respect to the prayer of your servant, that your eyes may be open toward this place night and day." His words carried over the crowd, soft and solemn, blending with the hum of thousands whispering amen. When he finished, he rose and blessed the people, saying, "The Lord has given rest to his people Israel, according to all his promises." That night, as the last torches burned low, Solomon remained alone in the courtyard. The scent of sacrifice lingered in the air, the moon casting silver upon the golden roof. Then, in the stillness, came the voice he had once heard at Gibeon. "I have heard your prayer," it said. "I have hallowed this house which you have built, to put my name there forever. My eyes and my heart shall be there perpetually. If you walk before me as your father David walked, I will establish your throne. But if you turn aside, this house shall become a ruin, and Israel a proverb among nations." The words pierced Solomon's heart with both comfort and warning. For a moment, he felt again the humility of his youth, the boy kneeling beside his father's bed, the dreamer who had asked not for power but for understanding. Now he was more than a dreamer. He was the builder of a sanctuary where heaven itself had bent to earth. Yet he knew the promise came with peril. In the months that followed, Jerusalem became a city of pilgrimage. From distant lands, travelers came to see the wonder of Solomon's temple, the shining crown of a kingdom once born in blood. The courtyards filled with worshippers, the priests in white linen moving like doves through the incense smoke. At sunrise, the golden doors caught the light, turning the entire mount into a blaze of sacred fire. In those days, Solomon's peace seemed eternal. The people prospered, the land was fertile, and the king's fame spread across every border. From Egypt to Mesopotamia, his name was spoken with reverence. Kings sent tribute, queens sent gifts of gold and rare perfume. The temple stood as a beacon of divine favor, its walls echoing with psalms of thanksgiving. Yet within the splendor, Solomon felt something stir, not pride, but an ache he could not name. The temple was complete, but his work was not. He had built a house for God, but the mysteries of creation still beckoned him beyond stone and gold. He began to ponder the invisible structure of the world, the order of seasons, the harmony of stars, the reason behind joy and sorrow. He would walk the temple courts at night, the city asleep beneath him, and listen to the silence between the wind and the echo of his own steps. Even this house, he thought, glorious as it is, cannot contain the fullness of the eternal. The thought both humbled and haunted him, for wisdom had taught him that every perfection carries the seed of its undoing, and that the higher one builds toward heaven, the longer the shadow cast upon the earth. Still, he did not waver in faith. He continued to compose songs and psalms for the temple choirs. Musicians played harps and lyres in intricate harmony, the melodies rising like prayer through the open roof. Pilgrims wept as they listened, feeling that in the sound itself was something divine, the meeting of mortal longing and immortal grace. Generations later, travellers would still speak of the temple's beauty, its golden shields, its shimmering curtains, its altar of pure bronze. They would tell how the air inside seemed to breathe, how sunlight, filtered through gilded lattice, glowed like liquid honey. But none could capture the stillness of that moment when Solomon, the architect of God's house, bowed his head beneath the weight of wonder, realizing that even in all his wisdom, he had only begun to glimpse the edge of eternity. For the temple was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of another, the search for understanding beyond understanding, for the wisdom not of kings but of the soul. The same voice that had once blessed him now lingered in silence, leaving him to ponder the hardest lesson of all, that even the builder of the holiest house must someday confront the fragile foundations of his own heart, the king's palace and the city of David. The days that followed the dedication of the temple glowed with the peace of fulfillment. The Ark of the Covenant had found its resting place. The city of Jerusalem, once a stronghold of stone and song, now stood crowned with the house of the Lord. But Solomon's vision did not stop there. He had built a dwelling for God. Now he would build one worthy of a king, not in vanity, but in reflection of the order and beauty that heaven itself had shown him. The temple was the soul of the realm. The palace would be its mind and heart, the place from which justice, learning, and prosperity would flow outward like rivers from a single spring. It took 13 years to complete the royal complex, nearly twice the time it took to build the temple. To Solomon, this was not negligence, but perfection sought in detail. The labourers who once carved limestone for God's house now turned their chisels toward the palace terraces. Builders from Tyre and Byblos worked alongside Israelites, and the same fragrant cedar that panelled the temple now lined the halls of the king. The scent of it clung to the air, warm, resinous, alive as though the very wood whispered of the forests from which it had come. The palace complex rose on the southern slope of the city, overlooking the valley of the Kidron. It was no single building but a constellation of courts and chambers, the house of the forest of Lebanon, with its 45 cedar pillars gleaming like bronze in the sun. The hall of pillars, vast and echoing, where the king received emissaries and scholars, the hall of judgment, where the ivory throne of Solomon stood flanked by golden lions, a symbol of wisdom guarded by strength. Each hall was a world of its own. The walls shimmered with polished stone and fine gold leaf. Floors of inlaid ivory and black basalt reflected the torchlight like still water. In the courtyards, fountains murmured beneath carved cherubim, the water flowing into marble basins shaped like lilies. Servants moved quietly through colonnades, their sandals whispering over the smooth tiles. Musicians practiced in shaded galleries. Scribes copied laws and proverbs onto scrolls of prepared parchment. Artisans wove tapestries depicting vines, birds, and stars. Outside the palace, the city transformed around it. Jerusalem was no longer a fortress, it became a living heart of civilization. Streets widened, paved in white stone. Markets overflowed with copper, wine, and incense. The air thrummed with trade and laughter. Along the walls, towers rose like sentinels, each bearing a name: Hananel, Meah, Ophel. Within, gardens bloomed terraces of myrtle and pomegranate, olive and fig. The people began to call it not only Jerusalem, but Ir Shlomo, the the city of Solomon. Yet Solomon himself, ever humble before creation, still honoured its first name, the city of David, for it was his father's harp and sword that had made all this possible. He ordered the archives expanded so that the history of his people would not fade. Scribes and recorders documented births, treaties, and songs. They catalogued the wisdom of distant lands and the rhythms of harvests. The palace became a sanctuary of knowledge. Philosophers from Egypt debated with Hebrew elders. Traders from Sheba brought spices and tales of desert gods. Astronomers mapped the constellations above the temple's golden roof. The air was alive with language, Aramaic, Phoenician, Egyptian, and the lyrical cadence of ancient Hebrew. In this thriving capital, Solomon's reign took on its full radiance. He walked its terraces, not as a conqueror, but as a gardener of peace. At dawn, he stood upon the balcony of his private chamber, where the view stretched from the gleaming temple to the violet hills beyond. The sound of the city waking below, merchants setting up stalls, the clang of hammers, the cry of doves filled him with quiet pride. This, he thought, is the kingdom I prayed for, not the tyranny of fear, but the harmony of labour and faith. To maintain that harmony, he governed with calm precision. He continued to expand his network of officials, assigning overseers to each district. The revenues they collected were immense silver from Arabia, spices from Sheba, horses from Egypt, gold from Ophir, and tribute from all who sought Israel's favour. But it was not greed that drove his economy. It was vision. Solomon saw trade not as exploitation, but as exchange, the lifeblood of connection among nations. He established a fleet at Ezion-Geber, near the Red Sea, where Phoenician sailors and Hebrew craftsmen built ships capable of reaching the distant ports of Tarshish and India. From these voyages came wonders, ivory and peacocks, sandalwood and apes, precious stones and strange music. The court chroniclers wrote of them with awe. Never before, they said, had a king of Israel seen such wealth or wisdom gathered under one crown. Yet for Solomon, the truest treasure was not gold or gem, but knowledge. Each cargo carried not just goods, but stories, and in those stories, he sought glimpses of divine order. He began to correspond with scholars from Babylon, priests from Egypt, and poets from Tyre. He studied their customs, their myths, their sciences. To some, it seemed strange that the king of Israel should listen to pagans. To Solomon, it was simply part of his calling. All wisdom, he said once to his scribes, flows from the same river, though men drink from different banks. Within the palace walls, evenings glowed with the light of hundreds of oil lamps. The scent of myrrh and honey wine filled the air. Courtiers and philosophers gathered to hear readings from scrolls or to listen as the king composed verses upon his lyre. His voice was low, measured, carrying the rhythm of reflection. Some of these poems would later form part of the Song of Songs, that tapestry of devotion and longing, of divine love, mirrored in human passion. He wrote, "Behold, you are fair, my beloved. Your eyes are doves by the rivers of waters." To Solomon, the language of love was not merely desire, but metaphor, a way to understand the yearning of the soul for truth itself. The same wisdom that judged nations could also whisper to the heart. Even in his splendour, Solomon did not isolate himself from his people. He often walked among them in disguise, dressed as a merchant or traveller, speaking with farmers and shepherds. From them, he drew the pulse of his kingdom, the laughter, the fears, the hopes. He listened to their sayings and preserved them in his growing collection of proverbs. He admired their simplicity, their directness, their faith that the land itself was sacred. In their toil, he saw the reflection of divine labour creation continuing through human hands. At the edges of the city, new quarters sprang up for metalworkers, for potters, for weavers. The streets glowed with the orange light of furnaces, the air filled with the rhythmic clang of hammers. Night and day, Jerusalem pulsed with life. Visitors described it as a place where time itself seemed to pause, where wisdom and joy walked hand in hand. But Solomon's greatest satisfaction came not from the splendor or wealth, but from the harmony he had built. "There is a time to build," he once murmured as he looked over the city walls, "and a time to be still and know it is good." His courtiers often found him silent, standing beside the great reflecting pool in the palace gardens, watching the stars shimmer upon the water. To him, the city below and the heavens above were reflections of one another, the kingdom of man mirroring the kingdom of God. Still, the peace of Israel rested upon delicate foundations. The taxes required to sustain the palace and temple were heavy. The labor to maintain trade and defense demanded constant oversight. Some among the people began to murmur that the golden age shone brightest for those nearest the crown. Solomon heard these whispers and understood their danger. He began to write again, his tone quieter now, tinged with melancholy. "Better is a handful with quietness," he wrote, "than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit." Yet he did not retreat into guilt or fear. His mind, vast and searching, was already turning toward new frontiers. The codification of wisdom itself, the attempt to capture in words what could not be contained in walls of stone. He called together his scribes and began dictating the proverbs and parables that would outlive his kingdom. "Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting get understanding." About Doc. As he spoke, the lamps flickered, their flames mirrored in the gold panels of the chamber. Beyond the palace, the city murmured a living organism, breathing through the streets that bore his name. He had brought Israel to its highest point, a civilization of peace and learning that glowed like a lamp in the darkness of the ancient world. From the hills of Judah, shepherds could see the temple and palace shining together under the same moon, the house of God and the house of the King, twin symbols of the covenant between heaven and earth. For a time, it seemed as though the dream of creation itself had come to rest upon Jerusalem, that the divine and the mortal had finally found harmony. And so the city of David thrived beneath its crown of gold, its gardens heavy with fruit, its air filled with psalms and laughter. Yet beneath that golden calm, destiny turned unseen. For the greater the beauty, the deeper the shadow it casts, and even as Solomon's wisdom reached its zenith, the forces that would one day undo it were quietly taking root, unseen in the heart of peace itself. The wisdom traditions begin. The years rolled forward like the slow turning of the earth, and the golden light of Solomon's reign deepened into something almost timeless. Across the land of Israel, in the vineyards, marketplaces, and mountain villages, the name of the king became more than a title, it became an idea. To speak of Solomon was to speak of wisdom itself, of understanding that saw beyond the veil of appearances into the secret harmony of all things. It was not only his judgments that shaped this legend, but the way he thought about knowledge, not as a weapon or a tool, but as a form of worship. In his palace, he had gathered the finest minds of the age, a circle of scribes, priests, and philosophers who worked not to flatter him, but to record the patterns of truth as they unfolded from his lips. These were the beginnings of what the world would later call the wisdom traditions, teachings that sought to understand the nature of life, righteousness, and the quiet law by which the universe moved. Each day began with stillness. Before the dawn broke over the hills of Judah, Solomon would rise from his chamber and stand before the eastern windows of the palace. The stars would still shimmer faintly over the desert horizon, and the air carried the chill of night. He would lift his eyes toward the first pale light and whisper, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." It was not a prayer of fear, but of awe, the deep recognition that all understanding begins in humility. From these dawn meditations came the words that would become the book of Proverbs, written first in the hand of his royal scribes, then copied by students and priests across the land. They wrote with quiet diligence, their reed pens scratching upon scrolls of parchment, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not upon your own understanding. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. These sentences were the distilled essence of a lifetime's contemplation, not commandments, but observations, not edicts, but reflections upon the nature of existence. They spoke of justice, temperance, patience, and charity virtues that bound society together more surely than walls or armies. The people learned them by heart, reciting them as they worked or prayed. A shepherd would murmur them as he watched his flock. A mother would whisper them to her child before sleep. As the proverbs spread, the very tone of Israel changed. The land itself seemed to speak in the rhythm of Solomon's wisdom. His sayings became the proverbs of daily life, as much a part of the landscape as the olive tree and the well. It was said that no argument could last long once a proverb of Solomon was spoken, for it pierced through pride and pretense like sunlight through fog. But the wisdom tradition was not confined to Israel alone. Word of Solomon's insight travelled far beyond the borders of his kingdom to Tyre and Damascus, to Egypt and Babylon. Scholars journeyed to Jerusalem not merely to trade gold or silk, but to listen and learn. They came bearing scrolls of their own, filled with the lore of stars, medicine, and mathematics. Solomon welcomed them, for he saw no conflict between faith and knowledge. To him, the study of nature was a form of devotion. To know creation, he told them, is to read the handwriting of the Creator. He studied the plants and trees of his kingdom, writing treatises on their healing properties. He observed the flight of birds, the habits of ants, the turning of seasons. He sought meaning in the way the rain fell and the rivers cut through stone. His curiosity was boundless, the curiosity of one who saw wisdom not as an end, but as an ever-expanding horizon. Yet for all his knowledge, Solomon remained aware of his own limits. He understood that the more a man learns, the more he perceives what he does not know. This humility, rare among kings, became the quiet soul of his teaching. "In the multitude of words there wanteth not sin," he wrote. "Therefore a wise man restrains his tongue." To preserve these truths, Solomon established schools of learning, Bate Sefer, houses of the scroll. There, young men studied the sacred law, the language of poetry, and the logic of discourse. The elders taught them to listen before speaking, to weigh their thoughts like merchants weigh gold. The king himself often visited these schools in disguise, asking riddles to test their insight. Those who answered well were brought to the palace to serve as scribes or counselors. Among these students grew a generation of thinkers who would carry Solomon's legacy long after his reign, prophets, poets, and philosophers who understood that wisdom was not a possession but a path. They compiled his writings, expanded upon his ideas, and carried them into future centuries, where they would shape not only Judaism, but the thought of the world. The palace became a kind of living library. Courtyards filled with scrolls, chambers were lined with cedar shelves heavy with parchment. Each scroll bore the careful markings of the royal archivists. Words of Solomon, son of David, king in Jerusalem. In the evenings, the king would summon his scholars to the Hall of Pillars. There, by lamplight, they would read aloud what they had gathered that day, proverbs, songs, and reflections. Solomon listened in silence, his expression unreadable, occasionally raising a hand to correct a line or clarify a metaphor. He spoke often in parables. "There are 3 things which are never satisfied," he told them one evening. "Yea, 4 things that say not, it is enough: the grave, the barren womb, the earth that is not filled with water, and the fire that saith not, it is enough." His listeners fell silent, for in those words they heard more than a lesson. They heard the pulse of truth itself, the mirror of life's endless hunger. Not all of Solomon's writings were moral or philosophical. Some were songs, lyrical meditations on love, nature, and the fleeting beauty of life. The Song of Songs, which tradition ascribes to his hand, was one of these, verses that sang of passion and longing, of the divine union between the soul and the Creator, clothed in the language of lovers. "Many waters cannot quench love," he wrote, "neither can the floods drown it." It was a revelation that even desire, when pure, could be holy, that human love was itself a reflection of divine harmony. To some priests, such writings seemed too sensual, too human, but Solomon saw no contradiction between heaven and earth. "If God made the rose," he said, "then the fragrance of love is his own design." In this he wove together what no other king had done, the sacred and the sensual, the law and the song, the wisdom of the mind and the wisdom of the heart. In those years, Jerusalem became the intellectual and spiritual center of the ancient world. Pilgrims came from every direction, the white-robed priests of Egypt, the star readers of Babylon, the camel caravans of Arabia. They came not to conquer, but to question. And Solomon, sitting beneath the cedar beams of his hall, answered each with patience, humility, and wit. One legend tells that he once debated an Egyptian scholar on the nature of time. "If all things pass away," the man said, "how can there be meaning?" Solomon smiled and replied, "Meaning is the shadow cast by eternity upon the passing world." Another tale speaks of his nightly dialogues with his own conscience, that still, inner voice, he sometimes called the friend in the dark. It whispered to him in moments of solitude, reminding him that even wisdom can become vanity if it forgets compassion. For now, though, the harmony held. His words nourished the people like rain upon the hills. Farmers quoted him, merchants praised him, and the land was quiet. The wisdom tradition had taken root, its roots deep in the soil of peace. But in the stillness that followed, something began to change within the king himself. As the years grew long and the palace grew vast, Solomon's gaze began to drift from heaven toward earth, from the laws of God to the beauty of the world he had made. And though beauty can lift the soul, it can also ensnare it. The seeds of longing had been planted. They would soon bloom in ways even the wisest could not foresee. The Queen of Sheba, the southern horizon shimmered like a mirage. Over the endless dunes of Arabia and the red hills of the Horn of Africa, a procession advanced, hundreds of camels draped in crimson cloth, their saddles glinting with gold and ivory. Perfume and incense filled the air, the scent of myrrh trailing behind like the breath of paradise. At the heart of this great caravan rode a woman unlike any who had entered Jerusalem before, the Queen of Sheba, ruler of the fabled kingdom that lay beyond the deserts of the south, where frankincense trees wept resin like tears of sunlight. Her journey had begun months before, spurred by rumor. Across the trade routes of the world, from Tyre to Memphis, from Babylon to the spice markets of Saba, merchants spoke of a king whose mind was greater than any sage, whose words could still storms of conflict, whose wealth gleamed brighter than the gold of Ophir. The queen, proud and learned in her own right, had listened and smiled. "We shall see," she said. "If such wisdom exists, I will test it myself." Sheba was a land of scholars, traders, and mystics, its queen no stranger to riddles or power. She governed with the calm grace of one accustomed to command, her reputation equal parts intellect and enigma. It was said she could read omens in the flight of birds and solve equations of trade and diplomacy that confounded even her advisers. Yet what drew her northward was not politics or wealth, but curiosity, the same restless hunger that burned within Solomon himself. She sought not to conquer, but to understand. As her caravan approached Jerusalem, the city seemed to shimmer in the heat, its golden roofs glinting like a mirage against the hills of Judah. The people gathered in wonder, for never before had they seen such splendor. Camels bore chests of precious stones, silks dyed in Tyrian purple, and spices whose scent carried on the wind for miles. The queen rode at the centre, veiled in white linen, her dark eyes sharp and serene beneath the rim of a jewelled crown. When she entered the palace, the air itself seemed to pause. Solomon, seated upon his ivory throne, rose to greet her. The hall blazed with reflected light, gold upon gold, the air rich with cedar and incense. Courtiers watched in reverent silence as the two sovereigns, the wisest of men and the most enigmatic of women, regarded one another for the first time. There was no arrogance in their meeting, only recognition. Solomon bowed, and the Queen returned the gesture. "Welcome to Jerusalem," he said softly, his voice calm as distant thunder. "You have crossed great deserts to find what you seek." "I have come," she replied, "to know if what I have heard is true, whether wisdom can live within a mortal man." She tested him with questions, riddles layered with metaphor, challenges meant to reveal the limits of thought. Some were mathematical, others philosophical. Still others probed the mysteries of morality and divine order. "What is that which flows but never rises?" she asked. "What is born of the earth yet stronger than stone? What walks without legs, speaks without a voice, and binds men tighter than chains?" To each riddle Solomon listened without haste, his eyes half closed, his expression still. When he answered, it was not with mere cleverness but with insight. "Time flows," he said, "but never rises. Faith is born of the earth and outlasts stone. And love walks without legs, speaks without words, and binds the world together." The Queen smiled, not in defeat, but in respect. "You are indeed wise," she said, "but your wisdom is not of books alone." For days she remained in Jerusalem, walking the halls of his palace, visiting the temple, and speaking with his scholars. She marveled at the harmony of his court, the balance of justice and learning, beauty and restraint. She watched the procession of servants, the precision of his administrators, the order that reigned even amid luxury. "Happy are your men," she told him, "who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom." In private, their conversations deepened. They spoke of faith, of power, of the loneliness that comes with understanding. Solomon shared his doubts, the weight of ruling a kingdom too vast, of holding wisdom that sometimes felt more burden than blessing. "Knowledge," he confessed, "is like light through a prism beautiful, but it divides what once was whole." The Queen listened, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "And yet without light," she said, "we walk in darkness. Perhaps wisdom's sorrow is the price of its gift." She showed him gifts from her homeland, carved ivory figures, golden goblets, and rare balsam oil distilled from trees found only in Sheba's mountains. But the greatest gift she gave was understanding the rare kind, born not of obedience, but of equality. With her, Solomon did not speak as king to subject, but as mind to mind, soul to soul. Their exchanges became legend, retold by poets for centuries. Some said they debated the nature of God and the stars until dawn. Others whispered that they spoke of love, not the passion of flesh, but the meeting of two spirits drawn by recognition. Whether such whispers were true or myth, none could deny the mark she left upon him. Before her departure, the Queen prepared to offer Solomon one last challenge. "Tell me," she said, "what is the most precious thing that cannot be bought with gold, nor found in the earth, nor stolen by any thief?" Solomon smiled faintly. "It is the heart that understands." She bowed her head. "Then may that heart never lose its light." When the Queen departed, the whole city gathered to watch her caravan wind down the hills, the air thick with the scent of myrrh and sandalwood. She left behind more than gold or spice. She left a memory that would ripple through history, the meeting of wisdom and wonder, of east and west, of man and woman who saw in each other the reflection of what they most sought within themselves. Long after her departure, Solomon would walk the palace gardens and recall her words. He would think of her as the desert thinks of rain, rare, distant, yet unforgettable. Some said he composed verses in her memory. "Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. The voice of my beloved is upon the mountains. He cometh leaping upon the hills." Whether those lines were written for her or for the divine, none could say. but the poets who followed called her the dark mystery of the south, the queen whose visit marked the high tide of Solomon's reign. Her story became legend, and with it, Solomon's fame grew even greater. Kings and philosophers across the world spoke his name with reverence. Envoys from lands yet unseen came bearing tributes. Distant rulers wrote seeking his counsel. The world had not seen such a kingdom of peace and intellect since the dawn of nations. But wisdom, like the sun, casts both brilliance and shadow. The more the world adored Solomon, the more he began to sense a distance growing between himself and the simplicity he once cherished. For though knowledge can unite minds, it can also isolate hearts. He had built a temple for God, a palace for kings, and a library for eternity, yet somewhere within, he began to feel the silence that lies beyond every answered question. The golden network of trade. Across the shifting sands and distant seas, the fame of Solomon's kingdom radiated like the gleam of the temple's gilded roof beneath the sun. The world's merchants began to speak of Jerusalem not merely as a city but as a destination of destiny. Its name passed through caravans and harbours, across the tongues of desert traders and Phoenician sailors alike. In every corner of the ancient Near East, the rumour of its prosperity carried with it the fragrance of cedar and the glint of gold. It was said that even the winds of the Red Sea carried whispers of its abundance, that the markets of Tyre and the courts of Memphis hummed with envy and admiration. The age of Solomon became an age of motion. From the dry wadis of Edom to the harbours of Ezion-Geber, roads lengthened like veins of light through the wilderness. The desert tribes who had once roamed in solitude now found purpose in the web of commerce that emanated from Israel's capital. Under Solomon's guidance, the land itself seemed to awaken into order. The king's architects built new cities and fortified trade posts along the caravan routes. Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer rose with heavy gates and towering walls, not as instruments of war but as beacons of trade and civilization. From the west, Phoenician ships arrived heavy with cedar and purple dye. From the east, caravans brought myrrh, frankincense, and silks from the oases of Arabia. From the south came ivory and gold from Ophir and Sheba, the routes stretching across the Red Sea like invisible bridges of wealth. Solomon's fleet, built in alliance with the Phoenicians, sailed these waters with sails of white linen that caught the wind like wings. It was a new kind of empire, one not founded by conquest, but by exchange. Each port and market carried the scent of distant lands. The quays of Ezion-Geber echoed with the shouts of sailors, the creak of timber, the rattle of copper and silver ingots being loaded. The sun rose over masts gleaming with salt, over hulls carved with lion heads and doves, symbols of the king's dual nature, power and peace. The sea had become his frontier, the wind his messenger. In Jerusalem, the wealth of the world converged. The city's markets overflowed with wonders. Carved ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltic shores, turquoise from Sinai, lapis from Mesopotamia. Spices perfumed the air so richly that even the dust of the streets carried sweetness. Gold gleamed on every surface, on the shields of the palace guard, on the throne's lions, on the vessels of the temple. Silver became so common it was said to be as worthless as stone. But the wealth that flowed into the kingdom was not hoarded. Solomon saw prosperity as the scaffolding for something greater, a vision of order and understanding across nations. He used tribute and trade to fund new libraries, new temples, and new schools. He employed artisans from Tyre and scribes from Babylon to work alongside his own people, blending their knowledge into a harmony that few empires ever achieved. To the north, he fostered peace with Damascus. To the west, he maintained alliance with the Phoenicians. To the south, he opened the desert to commerce with Sheba and Egypt. The world that had once been a mosaic of isolation began to interlock beneath his hand. Every new alliance deepened the glory of Jerusalem. Envoys arrived in long processions, bringing exotic beasts and treasures, Elephants and peacocks, leopards and parrots adorned the royal gardens. The palace itself became a museum of wonders. Fountains shaped like lilies spilled water scented with rose oil. Mosaic floors depicted constellations and seas, their tiles so smooth they glimmered like the surface of still ponds. Servants from foreign lands moved gracefully through the corridors, their clothing woven in the styles of their homelands, their presence a living testament to the empire's reach. In the royal archives, scribes recorded every exchange, every treaty, every shipment that crossed the Red Sea. The records grew into scrolls so vast they filled entire chambers of the palace. Yet Solomon, who presided over it all, remained unsatisfied by numbers alone. To him, trade was not merely the movement of wealth, but the movement of meaning, the way nations learned from one another, how ideas travelled in the same caravans as spices and gold. He often stood at the harbour of Ezion-Geber, watching the ships depart for Ophir, their sails catching the desert wind. The horizon shimmered with light, and the sound of the waves seemed to echo the rhythm of his heart. He saw in those ships not greed but purpose, the fulfillment of the promise that all peoples might one day live in the exchange of peace, not the theft of war. As the trade network expanded, the structure of the kingdom evolved with it. The 12 districts established earlier now thrived like branches of the same tree. Each region sent monthly provisions to the palace, ensuring stability and abundance. Roads were maintained, wells were deepened, and the safety of travellers became law. Banditry vanished under the weight of royal authority. The king's men patrolled the trade routes from Dan to Beersheba, ensuring that even the poorest merchant could cross the land without fear. In the evenings, Jerusalem glowed with oil lamps, hung from archways and terraces. Music drifted from courtyards, mingling with the fragrance of cinnamon and wine. Philosophers debated beneath the colonnades. Merchants counted their profits, and priests offered blessings at the temple. The hum of commerce became the heartbeat of peace. Foreign rulers sent envoys to study the organization of Solomon's kingdom. His methods were orderly yet humane, a government built not upon conquest, but upon wisdom. His justice ensured that no trader was cheated, no farmer overtaxed, no servant starved. The king's inspectors travelled the land with tablets of bronze, recording the prosperity of each region, ensuring that the abundance was shared fairly. The wealth that poured into the kingdom allowed for grand projects beyond the temple and palace. Reservoirs and aqueducts were built, feeding gardens and vineyards across the hills. Roads of stone stretched outward like spokes from Jerusalem, connecting remote villages to the great centres of commerce. Prosperity became not the privilege of the few but the inheritance of the many. And yet, even as the kingdom reached its zenith, Solomon began to perceive a subtle change within the air of his creation. Prosperity, like gold, was beautiful but heavy. The people's prayers grew shorter, their labour easier, their gratitude quieter. The scent of incense sometimes masked the smell of complacency. In the soft murmur of abundance, the ancient struggle that had once bound the tribes together began to fade. Still, the peace endured. Under Solomon's reign, no enemy breached the walls of Israel. No foreign army dared its borders. The very desert seemed to respect the hand of the wise king. His fleets returned with treasure every 3 years, their sails full and white, their cargoes rich beyond imagination. The chroniclers wrote that never again would the world see such wealth or peace in one man's lifetime. The king, standing upon his balcony, could look in any direction and see the fruit of his thought cities blooming where wilderness had been, ships gliding upon seas once feared, and nations speaking to one another in the language of trade rather than the silence of war. It was, for a moment, perfection. But perfection, as Solomon knew better than any, is the most delicate of all balances. Prosperity can dull the edge of purpose, and peace can make the heart forget its hunger for truth. The very abundance that had brought unity would soon begin to sow the seeds of division. For wealth is never content to rest. It demands, it tempts, it multiplies desires. As the ships sailed and the treasuries filled, Solomon began to turn inward once more. The horizon of his mind expanded beyond gold and goods, reaching toward the unseen, the laws of nature, the mysteries of the soul, the meaning of the fleeting wind. For though he had built a golden network that stretched across the earth, he had begun to feel the weight of another empire entirely, the uncharted kingdom within himself, the empire at its peak. The reign of Solomon reached a point where time itself seemed to pause and hold its breath, as though the world recognized that it was standing within the brief heart of perfection. The sun rose over Jerusalem each morning, its light scattering across golden rooftops, across the domes of the temple and the white walls of the palace terraces, until the entire city shone like a second sunrise. Pilgrims called it the Light of Zion. Merchants called it the Gate of the World. And for the first and last time in Israel's history, every border was quiet, every frontier at peace. From Dan to Beersheba, the land flowed with abundance. The terraced hills were thick with vineyards, the valleys glowed with barley and wheat, olive trees shone like silver under the wind. Herds grazed in silence along the plains of Sharon, and the rivers, once swollen with blood from endless wars, now mirrored the blue of an unbroken sky. It was said that the wild beasts themselves had grown tame under Solomon's rule, that even lions and jackals wandered the forests in peace. The people of Israel had never known such prosperity. Each family lived beneath its vine and fig tree, free from fear. In villages and cities alike, the air was filled with laughter and the sound of psalms. Festivals were celebrated not in desperation but in gratitude, the songs of thanksgiving carrying far into the night. The priests of the temple performed their duties amid fragrant clouds of frankincense, the choirs of Levites singing verses that spoke of wisdom, unity, and the covenant of peace. Jerusalem had become not merely a city but a symbol. To the north, to the east, to the farthest shores, it was known as the heart of an empire, unlike any other, not a dominion of swords, but a dominion of light. The roads that branched outward from its gates were arteries through which the life of the world flowed. The caravans that passed along them carried more than goods. They carried ideas, faiths, and stories, each returning with new threads to weave into the fabric of Israel's wisdom. Foreign rulers sought alliance and understanding. Kings from the Hittite plains, from Damascus, from the deserts of Arabia, sent emissaries bearing tributes. Pharaohs of Egypt sent chariots gilded in bronze, harnessed with horses bred from their own royal stables. Even the distant islands of the Aegean, hearing tales of the wise king, sent gifts of coral and wine. The nations that once warred now competed only to gain his counsel. Solomon received them all. His throne room became the center of a new world order, a living court of intellect and diplomacy. In its vast chamber, with walls of cedar and floors of ivory, the air hummed with the murmur of translators, with the slow turning of scrolls, with the quiet rustle of silk garments and the glint of jewels. The throne itself, carved from ivory and overlaid with pure gold, stood upon 6 steps guarded by 12 lions, 6 to the right, 6 to the left, symbols of power made gentle under wisdom. There Solomon sat, his face calm, his eyes thoughtful, his hands folded upon the arms of the throne. His garments were simple compared to those of the visiting kings, for he wore not splendor but serenity. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, carrying the certainty of one who had seen the pattern of the world and found it beautiful. He spoke not to impress, but to reveal. The great ones of the earth came to listen, and left changed, not defeated, but enlightened. The scribes recorded every exchange. They wrote that when Solomon reasoned with the philosophers of Egypt, he spoke of the order of stars and the balance of justice, showing that both followed the same unseen law. When he conversed with the kings of the north, he spoke of peace as the only lasting victory. When the envoys of Sheba returned after their queen's visit, they said that to hear his words was to feel the heart made still, as though one stood beside a river that reflected both heaven and earth. The wealth of Israel in these years became legendary. Gold flowed from Ophir and Tarshish in endless measure. The annual tribute filled the royal treasury with talents beyond counting. Silver became so plentiful it lost all value. It was said that stones were considered equal to silver in the streets of Jerusalem. Shields of beaten gold hung upon the walls of the palace, and the drinking vessels of the court were of pure gold. The temple's inner sanctum gleamed with such brightness that priests covered their faces in awe when they entered. Yet for all its magnificence, the splendor of Solomon's reign was more than material. Its true brilliance lay in harmony, the balance of thought, beauty, and faith. The city itself embodied this order. Its architecture followed sacred proportion. Every hall aligned with the sun, every courtyard built according to mathematical precision that mirrored the movements of the heavens. The sound of music filled the air, harps, lyres, flutes, and voices blending into harmonies that seemed to echo creation itself. Music was the lifeblood of the empire's peace, for through song the people remembered their unity. Beyond the city, the borders of the kingdom reached farther than any in Israel's history. From the Euphrates to the border of Egypt, the land paid homage. Yet Solomon never called it conquest. He saw it as a circle of trust, a network of understanding between nations held together not by fear, but by respect. Tribute was not extracted by the sword, but offered as alliance. The king's envoys travelled constantly, bearing letters sealed with the royal crest, the Star of Solomon, a symbol of balance between heaven and earth. Within this web of peace, learning flourished. Schools multiplied, scrolls were copied, libraries expanded. Knowledge became the kingdom's greatest export. Scribes wrote not only in Hebrew but in the languages of Egypt and Phoenicia, translating the wisdom of the world into a single tapestry. In every district, scholars taught children to read and count, to recite proverbs and understand law. Solomon's belief that truth belonged to all people became a living practice, a quiet revolution of thought that would outlast his throne. Art, too, reached new heights. Sculptors carved figures of birds and flowers, not idols, but symbols of beauty as divine reflection. Jewelers set stones into patterns of celestial geometry. Weavers created tapestries that shimmered with gold thread, depicting scenes of peace, harvest, and light. The palace gardens became wonders of the world, terraces of cypress and fig, fountains shaped like lilies, paths lined with alabaster. Foreign visitors wrote that to walk there was to feel time slow, to sense that heaven itself had touched the earth. But even perfection bears within it a fragile sorrow. In the quiet glow of his success, Solomon began to feel a stillness that was not peace, but distance. The people loved him, yet he walked among them less often. His counselors obeyed him, yet they no longer challenged his thoughts. His fame filled the world, but his solitude deepened. For when a man reaches the summit of wisdom, he finds no companions there, only silence, and the long echo of his own heart. He spent long nights in his study overlooking the city, watching the lamps flicker across the hills. From the palace gardens below came the scent of roses and cedar. The sound of the fountains lulled the night into stillness. He would write in the dim light, the tip of his stylus gliding across wax tablets, capturing thoughts that had begun to turn inward, reflections on the fleeting nature of human greatness. He began to notice the small shifts that come with abundance, the slow softening of discipline, the rise of vanity among courtiers, the idle extravagance of merchants. The people no longer spoke of the covenant as often as they once had. The priests grew rich from offerings. The nobles grew comfortable. What had been sacred simplicity began to shimmer with excess. Solomon, who had built his kingdom on the balance between heaven and earth, now sensed that balance tilting. He looked out over his shining empire and saw not only its glory, but its impermanence. The gardens would wither, the walls would crumble, the songs would fade. All things under the sun, he realized, shared the same fate to rise, to bloom, to fall, to be forgotten. The thought haunted him. In the depth of his insight, he discovered the shadow of futility that follows wisdom like a reflection. Still, the king continued to rule with justice and order. The peace held, the people prospered, but within the calm rhythm of life in Jerusalem, the seeds of decline were already sown. For the very perfection that made his reign divine had begun to draw his heart toward the world's beauty, the beauty of wealth, of art, of love, of many foreign lands, and the man who once asked only for wisdom would soon find himself ensnared by the endless desires of the heart. For now, however, the empire stood at its peak, vast, serene, radiant, and whole. The winds from the sea carried the scent of cedar and incense. The sun gilded the temple's dome until it burned like a star. And in that light, Solomon sat upon his throne, the wisest and richest of kings, his eyes turned toward eternity, his soul poised upon the delicate line between wonder and weariness, the hidden science of the king. In the fullness of his reign, when peace stretched like a golden horizon, and his name was spoken as far away as the Indus and the Pillars of Hercules, Solomon's mind turned inward toward the mysteries that no kingdom could contain. The world had bowed before his justice, merchants had filled his treasuries, scholars had spread his wisdom like seeds on the wind, yet within his soul there grew a quiet restlessness. He had measured law and power, studied men and nations, but still he sought to understand the deeper pattern that bound all creation together. From childhood he had been drawn to the hidden workings of the world. Even in his youth he had watched the stars, counting their movements, tracing the constellations that glided above the hills of Judah. Now, in the silence of his maturity, he returned to that fascination with renewed intensity. He began to perceive wisdom not only in words and judgments, but in the pulse of the earth itself, in the flowering of the olive, the spiral of the shell, the whisper of wind in the cedars. He saw that the same divine order that governed men also governed nature, and he resolved to know it completely. He built observatories upon the palace terraces, platforms of white stone open to the sky, where bronze instruments measured the rising and setting of the stars. Phoenician astronomers and Chaldean seers joined his scholars there, mapping the heavens with charts of polished copper. Night after night the king stood beside them, wrapped in a cloak of indigo, his eyes fixed upon the silent pageant above. He noted the paths of the wandering lights, the planets, and the cycles of the moon, and from their patterns he sought meaning, not for prophecy, but for understanding. He wished to discern the mind of the Creator through the language of creation. At dawn he walked among his gardens, recording the growth of every plant, the rhythm of each season. He studied the bees that circled his orchards, the doves that nested in the fig trees, the serpents that coiled beneath the stones. He dictated long treatises on the nature of herbs, on the healing powers of roots and resins, on the strange virtues of stones and metals. His scribes wrote thousands of verses describing the trees from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows from the wall. He spoke also of beasts and birds, of creeping things, and of fishes. Nothing escaped his observation, but his curiosity reached beyond the visible. He believed that wisdom was not only the knowledge of what is seen, but of what lies unseen, the secret currents of cause and effect, the harmony between number and form, sound and light. He studied the geometry of architecture, the proportion of the temple's courts, the ratios of its columns and altars, believing that in these measures lay reflections of the divine order. He measured the shadows of obelisks at noon, the length of days at solstice, the distances between planets, as if each were a note in a cosmic chord. The priests who watched him murmured that he was seeking to know the thoughts of God himself. Legends began to gather like dust around these studies. It was whispered that Solomon possessed secret books given by angels, scrolls of forbidden wisdom containing the names of the stars and the hidden language of beasts. Others claimed that he had discovered the art of commanding spirits, that he could speak to the wind and understand the speech of birds. Such tales were born from wonder, not malice, for his knowledge seemed beyond mortal reach. When he walked through his gardens, flocks of starlings followed as though answering his unspoken call. When he wrote at night, the oil lamps burned steady and bright, untouched by wind. He experimented with the powers of sound, crafting instruments that could mimic the voices of nature. He designed water clocks that measured time by the dripping of bronze basins, sundials that traced the hours with perfect precision. His workshops hummed with invention artisans, creating glass that caught the colours of dawn, metal workers casting mirrors so polished they reflected the stars. In the cool chambers of the palace, scribes recorded diagrams of pulleys and wheels, of irrigation devices that carried water upward through the terraces of the gardens. These were not miracles, but early steps toward science, born from a mind that saw creation as one vast, knowable design. For all his searching, Solomon's pursuit was never divorced from faith. To him, every discovery was a form of worship. He believed that the closer one came to understanding the structure of the world, the nearer one approached its maker. Yet the line between reverence and curiosity is thin, and there were nights when even he felt its tremor. Beneath the stars, he would sometimes wonder whether knowledge itself might be a kind of temptation, the same hunger that had once drawn Adam toward the forbidden tree. He prayed for balance, asking that his learning never exceed his humility. The scholars of his court revered him as the fountainhead of all knowledge. They called him Ben Elohim, the son of divine wisdom. They studied his writings as scripture and debated his parables long into the night. Among these writings were verses that spoke not of kingship but of existence itself, the rhythm of life and death, the vanity of human ambition, the eternity of the soul. In one scroll he wrote, "I turned myself to behold wisdom, and to know madness and folly, and I perceived that this also is vexation of spirit, for in much wisdom is much grief. And he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow." Those words, preserved through centuries, marked a turning in his thought. For the more deeply he delved into the mysteries of creation, the more he sensed the fragility of all human endeavour. Knowledge opened not only the gates of wonder, but also the abyss of futility. He saw that every empire, no matter how vast, was but a moment in time. Every discovery, no matter how profound, was a shadow of something greater. The same sun that nourished the vineyards would one day wither them. The same sea that bore his ships would one day erase their names. He began to write differently. His proverbs grew darker, his tone slower, contemplative. "Vanity of vanities," he wrote, "all is vanity." These words were not despair, but revelation. He had glimpsed the endless cycle beneath the surface of creation, the rising and falling, the building and breaking, the giving and taking. He understood that true wisdom was not in possession but in surrender, to stand in awe of the pattern without seeking to control it. Still, his curiosity would not rest. He commissioned craftsmen to inscribe symbols upon rings and tablets, geometric figures said to embody the balance of creation. Later generations would call these the seals of Solomon, emblems of wisdom's authority over the material and spiritual worlds. Whether they held any power beyond symbolism, none could say, but they became part of his legend, the image of a king who had mastered the language of the universe. Within the temple itself he left hidden symbols, carvings of lilies and palms, of oxen and cherubim, each placed with intention, each aligned to catch the light in a certain way at certain seasons. The building itself became a calendar of eternity, a silent hymn to the order he perceived. But no knowledge, however divine, can shield the heart from its own desires. As Solomon grew older, the balance he had so carefully maintained began to tilt. His pursuit of understanding drew him ever further into the company of those from foreign lands, scholars, merchants, and nobles who brought with them not only wisdom but also their gods. He welcomed them all, believing that truth could be found in every tongue. Yet with them came altars and idols, songs to foreign deities, and philosophies that blurred the line between curiosity and devotion. The king, ever open-minded, saw in their rituals echoes of divine mystery, yet the priests of Israel murmured that he was treading dangerous ground. They feared that the wisdom that once united the nation might soon divide its faith. Solomon, absorbed in his studies, scarcely noticed. His eyes still turned to the heavens, but the light he sought there began to waver, refracted by the countless reflections of beauty and desire that surrounded him. For now, though, his world remained luminous. The palace glowed at night with the warm shimmer of lamps, the air filled with the scent of cedar and wine, the courtyards alive with music and laughter. The scholars still wrote, the ships still sailed, the gardens still bloomed, yet within the mind of the king, something subtle had shifted the first awareness that even wisdom, when pursued without restraint, can become its own form of folly. He stood one evening at the edge of the terrace, the moon rising pale above the hills of Judah, the stars unfolding like a scroll. Below him the city lay silent, perfect, gleaming. He whispered a single thought to the night, though none heard it, that knowledge, like gold, shines brightest before it begins to tarnish. The shadow of excess. The years passed like gentle tides against the shore, their rhythm steady, their surface calm, yet beneath the glittering waters of Solomon's kingdom, the currents had begun to shift. The land was still rich, the harvests full, the people content, but prosperity had become a weight, pressing quietly upon the spirit of the nation. The very abundance that had once been the reward of wisdom now threatened to dull it. Jerusalem gleamed brighter than ever. The palace and the temple shone with a brilliance that drew travellers from the ends of the earth. Gold lined the beams of the banquet halls. Mirrors of polished bronze caught the light and scattered it like flame. Musicians played without pause, their harps and lyres filling the corridors with endless music. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and frankincense. At night, feasts stretched until dawn, torches flaring against the starry sky. What had begun as gratitude had become habit. Gratitude, once expressed in reverent offering, now lived as indulgence. The peace of Solomon's early reign had softened into comfort, and comfort, quietly, into luxury. The king himself, once the embodiment of simplicity and insight, began to taste the sweetness of grandeur with increasing ease. The wine was richer, the garments softer, the laughter louder. The wisdom that once bound him to the humility of his people began to sink beneath the weight of gold. To sustain the splendour, the kingdom laboured more heavily than before. The people, though not oppressed, began to feel the invisible cost of magnificence. Fields yielded their crops, not only to feed families, but to fill the tables of the court. Caravans that once brought gifts now brought obligations. Tribute was demanded where it had once been offered freely. Solomon, who had built the empire through gentle order, now relied upon its machinery, a vast network of collectors, overseers, and servants whose work never ceased. In the outer provinces, murmurs began. Farmers spoke of the old days when David had sung among them. Elders remembered a time when kings rode beside shepherds and prophets walked the streets. They still honoured Solomon, but their reverence had become more distant, touched by awe rather than love. The king of wisdom had become the emperor of splendour, unreachable behind the marble walls of his palace. Inside those walls, the king's world unfolded in a dream of luxury. His court expanded to thousands. His household became a nation unto itself. Cooks, perfumers, guards, singers, scribes, and servants, beyond counting. The banquets of the palace became spectacles of art and abundance. Whole herds of cattle and flocks of sheep were prepared each day. Peacocks from Ophir and quail from Arabia graced the royal tables. The goblets were of beaten gold, the plates of ivory inlaid with lapis and turquoise. Perfumed fountains rose in the courtyards, scattering mist over guests who reclined on silken cushions embroidered with thread of silver. Even Solomon's wardrobe became legend. robes woven with scarlet and blue, lined with white linen, clasped at the shoulder with carved onyx. His crown, set with 12 gems representing the tribes of Israel, glittered like a constellation. When he appeared in public processions, surrounded by guards in gilded armor, the people gasped as though beholding a vision of the sun itself. The chroniclers of Egypt compared him to Ra in his glory, and the poets of Babylon called him the morning star of the west. Yet Solomon himself, amid all this splendor, felt the faint ache of hollowness. He still rose before dawn, but the prayers that once poured from his heart now came slower, more deliberate, as though spoken through a veil. The presence of the divine, once near as breath, seemed to have retreated beyond the golden marble. His hands, accustomed to scrolls and instruments of thought, now reached more often for the tokens of comfort, the chalice of wine, the silken fan, the company of laughter. He was still wise, still just, but the simplicity of his soul was quietly eroding beneath the smooth tide of wealth. The kingdom mirrored its king. Prosperity, once the fruit of labor, had become the assumption of birth. The nobles grew proud, their houses rising like smaller palaces. The merchants measured virtue by coin, not by honesty. The priests, enriched by gifts and offerings, debated over gold rather than God. The music of the temple grew louder, more elaborate, drowning out the quiet voice of reverence. The people prayed, but many prayed for abundance rather than gratitude. In the royal city, art reached new heights, but so did vanity. Painters adorned walls with scenes of the king's victories. Sculptors carved his likeness in stone. The name of Solomon became both prayer and legend, his image both holy and human. To many, he seemed more a god than a man. The foreign embassies continued to arrive, bringing with them new alliances and new temptations. From Egypt came dancers and perfumers. From Phoenicia, architects and courtiers. From the East, philosophers and princes bearing gifts. Each alliance brought with it beauty, and with beauty, desire. Solomon's heart, once bound wholly to wisdom, began to divide itself among the many faces of the world. He took wives from noble houses across the earth, princesses of Moab and Ammon, of Sidon and Hittite blood, of Sheba and Egypt. Each union was a seal of peace, a bond of diplomacy, yet together they formed a web that grew denser each year. The harem of the king became vast, a mirror of his empire, its languages and cultures interwoven in fragrance and silk. These women were not mere consorts. Many were learned and persuasive, their minds sharp as their beauty. They brought to Jerusalem their customs and their gods, small idols of stone and wood, songs to Ashtoreth and Chemosh, altars perfumed with incense alien to the temple of the Lord. At first, Solomon allowed them space out of courtesy, believing tolerance itself a form of wisdom. All truth is of God, he had once said, and he saw no harm in allowing their worship to flourish beside his own. But what began as tolerance grew into curiosity, and curiosity into fascination. Their rituals were full of colour and mystery, their hymns haunting, their festivals vivid with firelight and dance. The king, who once sought to understand all creation, now sought to taste all its beauty. The priests whispered uneasily. The prophets grew silent, their warnings muffled by the luxury that surrounded them. Only a few dared to speak of the danger that had begun to take root, the subtle erosion of faith beneath the flood of indulgence. But Solomon, now burdened by the momentum of empire, did not hear them clearly. His mind, still vast, still seeking, had turned from heaven to the multiplicity of earth. In the gardens of his palace he built terraces for each of his queens, each adorned according to her homeland lotus ponds for the daughter of Pharaoh, cedar groves for the princess of Tyre, marble altars for the women of Sidon and Moab. Incense of every kind drifted on the breeze. The king walked among them, feeling the unity of the world's beauty, yet not perceiving that it was fracturing the unity of his soul. The burden of the crown grew heavier. The weight of administration, the complexity of diplomacy, the endless petitions of nobles and merchants drained his spirit. The very machine he had built for peace had begun to consume his peace. He turned increasingly to solitude, seeking refuge in the cool chambers of his library, surrounded by the scrolls of his youth. There, he would read his own words, "Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right," and he would smile faintly, knowing how far he had drifted from the simplicity of that truth. The empire still glowed outwardly, but its brilliance had begun to fade from within. The wisdom that had once governed every act now slept beneath the gilded surface of satisfaction. In the streets, laughter had a sharper tone. In the markets, fairness gave way to cunning. In the palace, the music of devotion mingled with the songs of desire. And though the stars still wheeled above Jerusalem as they always had, the king who once read their order now gazed upon them with weariness rather than wonder. The shadow of excess had fallen, not sudden, not cruel, but soft and gradual, like dusk following a long and radiant day. The kingdom did not yet know it was twilight. The king did not yet see that the glow he mistook for dawn was the reflection of sunset on the walls of gold. The allure of foreign gods, the air of Jerusalem grew heavy with fragrant cedar and myrrh, rose and smoke, and beneath that sweetness, something unseen began to change. The great city still gleamed like a dream, but in the hidden courtyards of the palace, other fires burned. Shrines of stone and bronze rose quietly among the gardens, altars built not to the Lord of Israel, but to the gods of distant lands. The voices of foreign songs mingled with the chants of the priests, and the once single-hearted city began to hum with dissonance. Solomon had not planned for this. His intent, as always, had been understanding to learn the ways of the world, to honour the many forms of devotion that existed beneath heaven. The queens who surrounded him came from lands whose people bowed before stars and rivers, before the sun and the moon, before gods who bore 100 names. They did not mean rebellion, nor did he mean apostasy. Yet together, without malice, they altered the spirit of his kingdom. In the beginning, it seemed harmless. A small shrine built for the daughter of Pharaoh upon her terrace, a grove of tamarisk planted for the Sidonian princess who longed for the forests of her home, a perfumed altar for the Moabite queen whose god was honoured with fire and song. Each was granted with love or courtesy, the indulgence of a king too wise to be afraid. The Eternal made all lands, Solomon reasoned, and all lands seek him in their own tongue. But devotion has a rhythm of its own, quiet and persistent. What begins as curiosity becomes habit. What is permitted in one heart soon stirs in another. The women who had come to Jerusalem as wives and envoys brought with them not only their gods but their memories, festivals of light, dances by moonrise, songs of supplication carried from generation to generation. Their laughter and music filled the gardens at night, and Solomon, wandering among them, felt the pull of nostalgia for lands he had never seen. He listened to their hymns, the strange lilting cadences sung to Astarte and Milcom, to Ashtoreth, the Queen of Heaven, to Chemosh, god of the flame. Their melodies were haunting, their rituals mysterious, their symbols gleaming with gold and starlight. The incense they burned was sweeter than any he had known. Its smoke curled upward in shapes that seemed to whisper secrets. He told himself he was only observing, that wisdom should fear nothing, that knowledge must embrace all things. But beneath the surface of understanding lay a subtler temptation, the desire to belong to every mystery, to taste every truth. He began to walk more often among the foreign shrines. He would stand in the half-light of dawn, watching the rising smoke, listening to the foreign prayers. Sometimes he joined them in silence, not kneeling, but observing with the same calm curiosity that had guided his youth. Yet what the eyes behold often becomes what the heart remembers, and in time, the fragrance of those altars clung to him. In the city, the priests murmured in sorrow. The high places outside Jerusalem filled with new temples built by foreign craftsmen, funded by royal decree. Mount of Olives, once sacred for its olive groves and view of the temple, now bore monuments to gods whose names the prophets would not speak. The smoke of many altars rose into the sky, twisting together, indistinguishable in the wind. The people, once devoted to one faith, began to wonder if perhaps there were many. Still, Solomon's mind, vast and luminous, sought only harmony. He told his scribes, "The eternal is greater than the shape of our worship. If all rivers flow to one sea, can any river be condemned for its course?" To him, this was philosophy, the pursuit of unity in multiplicity. To the priests, it was peril. They saw not enlightenment, but dissolution. They feared that the light that had once burned steady in Jerusalem was now scattering into sparks. The prophets, long silent, began to speak again. They came to the palace gates, wild-eyed, their garments dusty from the wilderness, their voices trembling with urgency. They cried that the king had turned aside, that the covenant of David trembled in its foundation, that the Lord who had once filled the temple with his glory now looked upon it with grief. But their words could not pierce the noise of music and laughter within the palace walls. The guards turned them away, and their warnings drifted like wind over stone. Solomon himself felt no anger toward them. He believed they misunderstood him, that they still clung to the narrowness of an age he had outgrown. He still prayed at the temple, still offered sacrifice, still lifted his hands to the sky in gratitude. Yet the simplicity of devotion had been replaced by the complexity of intellect. Where once his faith had been a flame, it was now a prism splitting the light into 1,000 colours, beautiful but divided. The change was subtle but unstoppable. His queens grew bolder in their worship. Their processions wound through the city with drums and banners, their festivals of fertility and moonlight drawing crowds of the curious. The people, ever eager for spectacle, followed. The boundary between reverence and entertainment began to blur. The sacred songs of Israel mingled with the chants of foreign tongues until the air above Jerusalem no longer carried one melody, but many. In the night, Solomon sometimes dreamed. He saw the temple bathed in light, then fading into shadow. He heard the sound of water and fire, of laughter and lament. He awoke with the memory of the voice that had once spoken to him at Gibeon, gentle yet unyielding. "If you turn aside, this house shall become a ruin." He would rise from his bed and walk through the silent corridors of the palace, the echo of his footsteps loud in the emptiness. The gold and marble, the carved lions, the fountains all gleamed coldly in the moonlight, beautiful but lifeless. He would stand at the window, gazing toward the temple, and for a moment feel the distance that had grown between him and the presence he once knew so clearly. Still, he could not turn back. The man who had once mastered the laws of heaven now sought to master the mysteries of earth. He told himself he was not abandoning faith, but expanding it. Yet even as he built new altars, something within him grew quiet, not the peace of wisdom, but the stillness of weariness. The scribes continued their work, copying his proverbs, his songs, his reflections, but the tone of his writings began to darken. He spoke more often of vanity, of the cycles of time, of the futility of human striving. His words no longer celebrated the order of creation, but mourned its impermanence. "I have seen all the works done under the sun," he wrote, "and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit." The joy of discovery had turned into the sorrow of comprehension. The golden empire endured, but its foundation was beginning to tremble. The harmony of heaven and earth that had defined Solomon's reign had become a tension between body and spirit, between wisdom and desire. The king who had once united nations now found his own heart divided among gods, among loves, among countless unanswered questions. From the Mount of Olives, the smoke of many altars rose together into the dusk. It mingled with the scent of cedar and rose, rising high above the temple, above the palace, until it vanished into the colourless sky, a symbol of devotion lost in confusion. And beneath that sky, Solomon stood alone on his terrace, the wind stirring his robe, his eyes upon the horizon, where the sun sank behind the hills. The glow that bathed Jerusalem was still beautiful, but it was the beauty of twilight, not dawn. The prophets warn, the splendor of Jerusalem did not fade at once. The city still blazed with light each evening, its walls glowing beneath the setting sun like the embers of a great fire. The songs of harps and flutes still drifted from the palace courtyards, and the air was still sweet with myrrh and cedar. To the eyes of the world, nothing had changed. The throne of Solomon stood firm, his wealth undiminished, his armies loyal, his wisdom legendary. Yet beneath the perfection, a quiet trembling had begun, a fault line too subtle for those blinded by gold to see, but deep enough to split kingdoms. The prophets felt it first. They had lived long in silence during the years of peace, their voices unnecessary amid prosperity. But now, as the smoke of foreign altars darkened the sky above the Mount of Olives, the Spirit stirred within them once more. They came down from the wilderness, from the caves and desolate valleys, their eyes burning with a light untouched by wealth. They came barefoot and ragged to the gates of Jerusalem, speaking words that unsettled even the wind. The people watched them with uneasy curiosity. Some mocked, calling them relics of a harsher age. Others listened with trembling hearts, though they dared not say so aloud. The prophets spoke of the covenant forgotten, of the law neglected, of a kingdom gilded but hollow. They said the heart of the king, the very heart of Israel, had turned from the one who had given him wisdom, and that no tower, no wall, no treasure could protect a nation whose spirit was divided. Their voices echoed through the streets, sometimes drowned by laughter, sometimes met with silence. They cried that the land was rich, but its soul poor, that the fields were full, but the temple empty, that the gold of the palace shone brighter than the Ark of the Covenant itself. They warned that the Lord, who had once filled the house with glory, would withdraw his presence, leaving only echoes in the chamber of the Holy of Holies. Solomon heard of their words, and though he did not see them himself, he felt them like distant thunder. His counselors urged him to ignore them, saying that poverty breeds madness and envy. The priests, now softened by comfort, called the prophets disturbers of peace. Yet somewhere deep within, the king felt the tremor of truth in their cries, for wisdom cannot silence conscience. It can only teach it to whisper. At night he lay awake, the sound of foreign flutes drifting through the open windows of the palace. The gardens below glowed with torchlight, the laughter of his queens rising and falling like waves. He would close his eyes and see again the cloud that had once filled the temple, the living presence of the divine that had made him tremble in awe, and he would realize how long it had been since he had felt that nearness. His prayers had become thoughts, his faith, philosophy. The voice that had once spoken to him in dreams was now silent. In his solitude he turned again to the scrolls of his youth, reading the proverbs he had written in the days when his heart was pure. The words seemed to come from another life. Better is the poor that walketh in his integrity than he that is perverse in his ways, though he be rich. He repeated the line softly, but the sound of it felt foreign in the vastness of the room. The prophets grew louder. They gathered near the city gates, their hair tangled, their faces streaked with dust. Some spoke of visions, of the temple burning, of the kingdom divided, of the throne standing empty beneath a darkened sky. Others spoke of mercy still possible, if the king would turn back his heart. But each day the palace gates remained closed. The guards barred their path, and their words fell upon stone. Still they did not relent. They walked the streets, speaking to the poor, to the workers who built the gardens and carried water to the palace. They reminded them of the days of David, when the king had danced before the ark in humility. They spoke of the covenant that bound heaven and earth, the bond that could not be gilded or replaced. Slowly, their words began to spread. The merchants whispered of them in the markets. The farmers repeated them in the fields. A quiet unease grew beneath the city's splendor, like wind stirring the dust before a storm. Solomon felt it in the air. His court remained loyal, but he saw the change in their eyes, a hesitation, a flicker of doubt. The songs of praise grew softer. The banquet seemed longer, more forced. The laughter no longer reached the soul. He tried to restore his focus through work, ordering new projects, aqueducts, fortresses, terraces for vineyards. The sound of hammers and chisels filled the land once more, but each new structure seemed only to echo his inner unrest. The walls rose higher, but they enclosed a hollow space. The fountains flowed, but they quenched no thirst. In his gardens, he began to speak less and wander more. He moved through the colonnades in silence, his mind heavy with questions he could not answer. The women who surrounded him grew restless. They felt the change and filled the air with music and dance to distract him. Yet even their beauty could not quiet the stirring of doubt. He began to see their altars differently, not as symbols of unity, but as fractures in the divine fabric of his kingdom. What he had once considered understanding now seemed indulgence. What he had once called tolerance now looked like neglect. One evening, as he stood upon the terrace overlooking the city, he saw a thin column of smoke rising from the Mount of Olives, the smoke of a foreign sacrifice. The sun was setting behind it, and the light turned the haze red, like blood. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he had allowed. The people were beginning to follow their king's example, building altars upon every hill, burning incense to gods whose names their fathers had never spoken. The unity of Israel was unraveling quietly, like silk beneath fire. He turned away, returning to the stillness of his chamber, and there he fell to his knees. His prayer was wordless, a sound more of sorrow than of speech. He felt no vision, no voice, no comfort, only the vast silence that follows when the divine presence withdraws. He understood, in that stillness, that his wisdom had led him far from the very source that had granted it. The next morning, a prophet came to the gates of the palace, an old man, gaunt and sun-darkened, leaning on a staff. He carried no weapon, only a look of fierce compassion. The guards hesitated but did not strike him down. He raised his hands and cried out, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Thus says the Lord, who raised David from the sheepfold and set Solomon upon his throne, because your heart has turned away, and you have built altars to other gods, the kingdom shall be torn from you. Not in your days, for the sake of David your father, but in your sons. One tribe shall remain, and the rest shall fall away." The people who heard him trembled, for his voice carried the weight of truth. The guards drove him away, but his words clung to the air like smoke. By evening, they had spread through every street and courtyard, whispered beneath every archway, repeated by every servant in the palace. When word reached Solomon, he did not rage. He dismissed the guards and sat alone, gazing out across the hills. The prophecy struck him not as punishment, but as consequence, the fulfillment of a pattern he had long foreseen, yet refused to name. The kingdom that had been built on unity would one day break apart as surely as the heart of its builder had divided itself. For days he withdrew from the court. The feasts continued without him. The music filled the palace as if to deny his absence. But within the king's chamber, silence reigned. He wrote again, not decrees or songs, but meditations, the thoughts that would later form the book of Ecclesiastes, a mirror of his own weary soul. "I looked upon all the works my hands had wrought," he wrote, "and on the labour I had laboured to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun." He wrote of the cycles of the world, of birth and death, of gain and loss, of wisdom and folly. There is a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. These were not the words of despair, but of awakening the confession of a man who had seen the limits of human greatness. Outside, The empire still shone, the ships still sailed, the gold still flowed, the temples still glowed at sunset, but within that brightness a shadow deepened, not a storm, but a slow twilight. The people sensed it without understanding, as animals sense the coming of night. The prophets vanished once more into the wilderness, their task complete. The king they had warned remained upon his throne, his crown still gleaming, his wisdom undiminished in the eyes of the world. But within, he carried the knowledge that every glory carries its cost. He had learned, too late, that wisdom alone cannot save the heart, and that the greatest of kingdoms is no stronger than the soul of its ruler. In the stillness before dawn, he often stood upon the balcony of his palace, gazing toward the temple. Its golden roof caught the first light of morning, radiant and silent. Beneath it, the Ark of the Covenant rested still, the tablets of law unbroken, the promise unforgotten. And in those quiet moments, Solomon felt both the grief of failure and the strange peace of understanding. The prophets had spoken truly. His house would endure for a time, but the golden age had begun to wane. The wisest of kings had become the saddest of men, and yet in his sorrow there was a deeper wisdom, a truth that would outlast all his walls and towers. For in seeing the end of all things, he had at last glimpsed eternity, the fall of the wise. The last years of Solomon's reign were years of stillness that felt like the air before a storm, calm, glittering, heavy. The empire remained magnificent to the outer eye, its ships still gliding over the Red Sea, its storehouses still overflowing, its markets loud with the barter of spices and gold. Yet within the splendour, the pulse of the kingdom slowed. The sound of hammers and songs faded. The fountains of joy that once sprang so freely began to dry beneath the dust of weariness. The king himself had grown old. The once dark hair now gleamed with silver. His step had softened, and his eyes, once bright with curiosity, carried the distant look of one who has seen all and found it wanting. In his youth, he had spoken of peace and justice. In his maturity, he had built temples and treaties, but in his old age, he spoke little at all. Those who saw him on the palace terraces mistook his silence for serenity, yet those who knew him saw the weight that pressed behind it. He no longer presided over the great councils as he once did. Decisions passed through ministers, edicts through scribes. The machinery of empire, vast and efficient, no longer required the hand of its architect. Solomon had built a kingdom that could run without him, and that was both his triumph and his grief. The years of excess had left their mark. The treasury, though immense, could not sustain the appetite of the court. The taxes grew heavier upon the people, the labour more demanding. Solomon's palaces, his gardens, his shrines, all required endless maintenance. The beauty he had built to honour wisdom now consumed it, and in the villages, resentment began to stir like dust in the wind. The people who had once called him the King of Peace began to whisper of the burdens he placed upon them. Beyond the borders, the alliances that had once ensured stability began to fray. The vassal kingdoms that had long sent tribute now saw the king's age as weakness. Edom and Damascus murmured of independence. Egypt, once bound to Israel through marriage and diplomacy, began to rearm. From the north came traders who were spies. From the south, emissaries who were rebels in disguise. The world that had once bowed to Solomon now waited quietly for his death. He knew it, though few dared to speak of it. The wisdom that had guided his youth now returned, sharpened by age, stripped of pride. He saw his empire as a man sees the sea from a mountaintop, vast, glittering, but distant, untouchable. He had once believed he could understand all things under the sun. Now he knew that all things under the sun must fade. He spent his days walking the gardens that he had built in his glory. The terraces of the palace were heavy with fruit and shadow. The fountains whispered among lilies and reeds. He often paused by the reflecting pools, where once he had watched the stars. Now he saw only the reflection of his own face, lined, weary, noble, haunted. The sound of laughter from the courtyards no longer pleased him. The music of harps, once a comfort, now felt like memory turned to echo. He began again to write, not decrees or hymns, but confessions. The scrolls that came from his chamber were darker, quieter than the proverbs of his youth. He wrote of vanity, of the futility of striving, of the beauty and sorrow of impermanence. All go unto one place, he wrote. All are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. He who had mastered all things now surrendered to the simplest truth that man is but a breath, a shadow, a fleeting whisper of the divine. The people still revered him. They came to the temple to hear his name, to speak of his works. Yet even their reverence had changed. It was not love, nor even awe, but distance. He had become a legend while still alive, a figure so large that no one could truly touch him. The King of Wisdom had become an image carved in gold, admired, but no longer understood. In the hills beyond Jerusalem, the prophets who had once warned him now kept their silence. They had spoken their truth, and time itself was fulfilling it. The altars to foreign gods still stood upon the Mount of Olives, their fires flickering by night. Solomon had not torn them down. He had lost the will to destroy what he had once permitted. The same tolerance that had built his empire now bound his hands. He spent his nights in solitude, staring at the distant glow of those forbidden flames. He knew they were the visible sign of his own divided heart, the physical echo of an inward fall. Yet he could not bring himself to extinguish them. The man who had once commanded armies with a word could no longer command his own memory. Each altar represented a moment of passion, a promise, a piece of himself given away. To tear them down would be to admit how much of himself had already been lost. His queens moved through the palace like spirits of a forgotten age, their beauty untouched by time, their laughter thinned. They had given him sons and daughters, hundreds of them, but even among his heirs he sensed division. Rivalries and ambitions already stirred among the princes, each mother whispering of her child's destiny. The harmony that had once defined his court was fracturing into quiet competition. The unity of Israel would not long survive its king. The Lord, who had once appeared to Solomon in dreams and fire, no longer spoke. The silence was not wrath but distance, the distance of a teacher whose lesson has already been given. Solomon, who had once prayed for wisdom, now prayed only for forgiveness. Yet even that prayer felt unanswered, not through cruelty, but through the law of cause and effect. He was reaping what he himself had sown. He began to understand the nature of decline, that it does not arrive as thunder or fire, but as dusk, spreading softly until the world is shadow. His kingdom was not collapsing, it was settling into weariness. The people still worked, the priests still chanted, the ships still sailed, but the heart of Israel beat slower. The song of creation that had filled the land was now a murmur, a sigh. Sometimes, in the cool before dawn, he would ascend to the temple alone. The guards, recognizing their king, stepped aside in silence. He would walk through the colonnades, past the golden doors, into the great hall where the scent of incense lingered. The priests slept, the torches flickered low. In the center of the darkness stood the altar. He would fall to his knees before it, pressing his forehead against the cold stone. He never spoke. He no longer asked for understanding, only to be remembered. He understood now what his father David had known from the beginning, that a kingdom is not held by stone or gold or law, but by the covenant of the heart. And that covenant, once broken, cannot be restored by intellect alone. He had built cities, ships, palaces, libraries, yet he had failed to build the one house that endures, the house of the soul. In the twilight of his reign, the whispers of rebellion grew stronger. In Edom, Hadad the prince raised his standard. In Damascus, Rezon the warrior declared himself king. From the tribes of the north came murmurs against the taxes and labor demanded by Jerusalem. Solomon heard the reports with calm acceptance. He did not send his armies. He understood that what was unfolding was not war but consequence. The unity he had once imposed could not survive the fragmentation of belief. His scribes, seeing his sadness, begged him to rest. They told him his works would outlive him, that his wisdom would endure forever. He smiled faintly and said nothing. In his heart he knew that even wisdom is only a lamp, and every lamp, no matter how bright, burns out. Yet he took comfort in the thought that the light it had given might linger a little while in the darkness after him. The last years passed in quiet melancholy. The banquets dwindled, the music softened. The king spent his evenings gazing from his balcony at the horizon. The sky over Jerusalem was still golden at sunset, but the hue was that of autumn, warm, fading, tender. The wind from the desert carried the faint scent of ash. One night, as the moon rose pale above the temple, Solomon looked out across the city and whispered to himself the words that would become his epitaph. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. I have carth included. He rose from his chair, walked to his chamber, and lay down. The torches flickered low, the air still and cool. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift through memory, the boy kneeling beside his father's bed, the dream at Gibeon, the shining temple, the laughter of Sheba, the whisper of the prophets. Then, in the gentlest silence, he surrendered his breath. When morning came, the palace was still. The servants moved like ghosts. The priests dressed in white and carried his body to the city of David. All Jerusalem gathered to mourn. The bells of the temple rang until their sound seemed to tremble across the hills. They laid him in a tomb of stone beside his father's and sealed it with gold. The air was filled with incense and weeping. The people said the sun dimmed that day, that even the wind slowed in mourning. But over the city he had built, life continued, the markets reopened, the songs resumed, the wheels of empire turning as they always had. Yet the spirit that had animated it was gone. The golden age had ended. In time, his kingdom would divide north against south, brother against brother, just as the prophet had foretold. The temple would still stand, shining in the sun, but its sanctity would waver. And generations later, when the children of Israel told stories of their past, they would speak of Solomon not only as the wisest of kings, but as the saddest, the man who touched heaven with his mind but could not hold it in his heart, the divided inheritance. The death of Solomon passed through the kingdom like the dimming of a great lamp. For 40 years his wisdom had governed the rhythm of Israel's peace. Now that light was gone, and the world felt strangely hollow, the throne stood draped in black, the palace silent except for the echo of footsteps. The priests of the temple burned incense day and night, mourning not only the man but the age that had ended with him. In the days that followed, the people spoke his name in reverence, yet beneath the grief lay uncertainty, for though the king had built cities, libraries, and gardens that rivaled paradise, he had not built unity that could outlive him. The vast machine of empire waited for direction, its balance held by habit rather than conviction. And beyond the walls of Jerusalem, the tribes that had long submitted to his authority stirred restlessly, their old rivalries awakening like embers rekindled in the wind. The crown passed to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, born of a royal mother but untested, raised in luxury and shadowed by the greatness of his father. He was neither cruel nor wise, but uncertain, a man who inherited glory without earning it, and burden without preparation. The courtiers hailed him as the heir of peace, but the people saw in his youth a question the heavens themselves seemed slow to answer. From the north came the elders of Israel, weary from years of tribute and labour. Under Solomon's reign, the taxes that fed Jerusalem's splendour had grown heavier, the conscriptions longer. Though they had borne them out of reverence for his wisdom, they now came before his son seeking mercy. They met Rehoboam at Shechem, where the tribes had gathered for his coronation. and spoke plainly. Your father made our yoke grievous. Therefore lighten the heavy service of your father, and we will serve you. Telvramas. Their words were not rebellion, but a plea, an invitation to begin anew. The young king listened, his face proud and uncertain. He asked for 3 days to consider. He turned first to the elders who had served his father, the men who had seen empires rise and fall. They bowed and said, If you will be a servant to these people today, and speak kindly to them, then they will be your servants forever. But Rehoboam, insecure in his power, turned next to his own companions, the young courtiers raised with him in the ease of the palace, who knew nothing of toil or patience. They laughed at the humility of the elders and said, Speak to the people thus. My little finger shall be thicker than my father's loins. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. Their arrogance flattered his vanity, and vanity was all the crown could offer him now. When the people returned, Rehoboam spoke the words his youth demanded, not the words his kingdom needed. The sound of them rolled like thunder through the assembly, and the silence that followed was not reverence but disbelief. Then from among the crowd rose Jeroboam, son of Nebat, a man once favoured by Solomon and later exiled for his ambition. His voice rang out like a blade drawn in sunlight. What portion have we in David? To your tents, O Israel. It was not a shout, it was a sundering. The northern tribes turned their backs and departed. 10 tribes went north, leaving Judah and Benjamin to the house of David. In a single moment, the kingdom Solomon had united was broken. The golden empire split like a vessel dropped upon marble, each fragment glittering for a moment before fading to dust. Rehoboam fled to Jerusalem, trembling with rage and confusion. He gathered his generals and prepared to march north to reclaim what was lost. The horns of war sounded once more in the city of peace. The people, already weary, prepared for battle, but as the armies readied themselves, a prophet came to the gates, his voice calm yet firm. You shall not go up nor fight against your brethren, for this thing is from the Lord. The words fell like rain upon fire. Rehoboam hesitated, and in that hesitation the will to war dissolved. He lowered his sword, the armies disbanded, the house of David remained, but smaller, quieter, a single flame where once a sun had burned. Northward, Jeroboam established his rule, building his capital at Shechem. Fearing that his people might return to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, he built new sanctuaries, golden calves at Bethel and Dan, declaring them symbols of the same God. But the gesture that began as pragmatism became idolatry, and the faith of Israel fractured as surely as its kingdom. In the years that followed, the once united land became 2 rival realms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. The peace of Solomon was remembered like a dream from childhood, distant and fading. Trade faltered, roads fell into disrepair, and the songs that had once bound the people together were replaced by anthems of separation. The temple in Jerusalem still gleamed, its golden doors catching the light, but the crowds grew thinner. Pilgrims came from Judah and Benjamin, yet the sound of their hymns no longer filled the courtyards as before. The priests performed their rituals with diligence, but without the fire that once descended upon their fathers. Even the ark within the Holy of Holies seemed to rest in silence, its presence quiet as if listening to the echo of a promise unfulfilled. The northern kingdom, though rich in numbers, lacked the centre of spirit that Jerusalem had given it. Kings rose and fell quickly, some through war, others through deceit. The unity that had once drawn nations toward Israel now repelled them. Neighbours who had once brought tribute now sent armies. The alliances Solomon had crafted with such care unravelled like old cloth. Egypt turned its face away. Tyre demanded trade no longer. The world that had once looked upon Jerusalem as the light of peace now saw only division. In Judah, Rehoboam grew old and bitter. He fortified cities, built towers, and filled his armories with weapons, but his heart was restless. He could not escape the shadow of his father's name. The people spoke of Solomon with longing and of Rehoboam with resentment. Even his victories felt hollow, for every triumph reminded him of what had been lost. The years turned, and with them, memory softened into legend. The grandeur of Solomon's age became a story told to children at dusk, the time when silver was as common as stone, when the Queen of Sheba came bearing gifts, when peace ruled from the river to the sea. The people spoke the words wistfully, as though reciting a prayer to a vanished god. And yet, through all the ruin, something of the king endured. His writings were copied by the scribes of both kingdoms, the Proverbs, the Song of Songs, the Ecclesiastes. They passed from hand to hand, across generations and wars. His voice lived on, calm amid chaos, reminding those who listened that the measure of a man was not his palace or his armies, but the clarity of his heart. Better is a handful with quietness, he had written, than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. The people repeated it without knowing that in those words lay both his wisdom and his warning. For Solomon's life had become a mirror of the world itself, radiant, flawed, endlessly searching. He had reached for perfection and found its shadow. He had united heaven and earth, only to discover that both are fragile when divided by pride. The kingdoms that followed bore the imprint of his greatness and the echo of his fall. In time, the stones of his temple would crack, and foreign banners would fly above its ruins. But his words, carved not in stone but in the soul of humanity, would endure. They would whisper through centuries, carried on the breath of prophets and poets, reminding each generation of the truth the wisest man had learned too late, that knowledge without humility is emptiness, and power without love is dust. The divided inheritance of Solomon was not merely the sundered map of Israel and Judah. It was the divided nature of humankind itself, the eternal struggle between wisdom and desire, spirit and flesh, light and shadow. The kingdom had fallen, but the lesson remained, alive as long as hearts continued to seek understanding under the same unchanging sun. The echo of vanity. The generations that followed Solomon lived in the long shadow of his glory. The children of Israel spoke of his reign the way old men speak of summer after a harsh winter, with longing and disbelief. The golden years had become myth, their radiance exaggerated by memory, their lessons softened by time. Yet beneath the stories of wealth and wisdom, a quiet understanding lingered that something divine had once passed among them and was now gone, leaving behind only the echo of its departure. In the northern kingdom of Israel, kings rose and fell with the passing seasons. Some tried to imitate Solomon's grandeur, building shrines and palaces of their own. Others turned to idols outright, invoking foreign gods to secure their thrones. Prophets cried out from the hills, warning that each false altar was another crack in the covenant, another step toward exile. But power is a harder god to deny than stone or fire, and the kings listened only when ruin stood at their gates. In Judah, Solomon's descendants held to Jerusalem and the temple. Yet even there the faith was weary. The priests went through the motions, the rituals continued, but the fire that had once filled the Holy of Holies no longer descended. The ark remained, yet the people no longer felt its living presence. The temple had become a monument to a forgotten intimacy, a house still standing, but empty of its guest. The writings of Solomon spread through the land like scattered seeds. His proverbs were recited in the markets, his songs sung at weddings, his meditations whispered at funerals. Farmers and scholars alike knew his words by heart, though few understood them. His wisdom had outlived his empire, yet it had become detached from the pain that had given it birth. People quoted his lessons about humility while pursuing pride. They admired his words about simplicity while coveting gold. They repeated, "All is vanity," yet continued to chase the wind as eagerly as he once had. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of Solomon, that he had become the perfect mirror of mankind. His greatness revealed not only the height of human wisdom, but also its limits. His empire had been the summit of civilization, and yet from that summit he had looked down and seen that everything beneath the sun was fleeting. The people who came after him lived within the pattern he had described, their joys and failures echoing his own, repeating endlessly the truth he had written. What has been will be again, and there is nothing new under the sun. As the decades passed, the northern kingdom turned more deeply toward its idols. Prosperity returned for a time, fields abundant, trade revived, palaces gleaming, but it was a shallow glow, like light upon water before a storm. The prophets of that age, Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, carried the same spirit that had once spoken through Nathan and Ahijah. They called the people back to the covenant, warning them that wealth without righteousness was a mirage, that altars built on vanity would crumble beneath their own gold. Their words were fierce, yet they were only echoes of Solomon's last lament that everything built without humility must fall. In Judah, the memory of the great king remained carved into the city itself. His temple still caught the morning light, its gilded doors opening to the songs of priests. The people who climbed the steps whispered his name, as if invoking a blessing. They remembered his glory, not his sorrow, his power, not his repentance. They forgot that wisdom without obedience leads only to emptiness. But not all forgot. In the quiet chambers of the scribes, men copied his words with trembling hands. They saw in his writings not pride but confession, not vanity but vision. They recognized that his despair had been a doorway, not an ending, that to see the vanity of all things was to glimpse the eternity beyond them. They preserved his scrolls through war and exile, through the burning of cities and the scattering of tribes. His voice survived even when his throne did not. In later centuries, when Jerusalem itself was conquered and its people carried away in chains, it was said that the exiles sang the words of Solomon in foreign lands. Beneath strange skies, by rivers far from Zion, they whispered his verses as comfort. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. Those who had lost everything clung to those words like driftwood in a flood. In the wisdom of their fallen king, they found the endurance of their own faith. The philosophers of other nations, too, came to honor Solomon. The Greeks called him the man who first understood that wisdom begins with wonder. The Persians called him the king who knew the names of angels. The Arabs wove tales of him into their own traditions, calling him Suleiman, the ruler who commanded the jinn and spoke to the wind. Even among peoples who had never seen Jerusalem, his legend endured not merely as a ruler of wealth, but as the archetype of the wise man who learns too late that knowledge cannot save the soul. Yet beyond the myths, the truth of his story lingered quietly in the scrolls of Israel. The scribes who preserved them saw his life as both triumph and warning. They understood that he had stood closer to heaven than any man before him, and yet his heart had strayed farther than most. They saw that his fall was not the fall of a tyrant, but of a dreamer, one who had loved wisdom more than obedience, and beauty more than faith. The world changed. Empires rose and fell. The languages of men shifted like the tides. The descendants of Israel wandered across continents, building new homes and new hopes. Yet wherever they went, the words of Solomon followed. His voice became the conscience of generations, reminding kings that their glory would fade, merchants that their riches would rot, lovers that beauty was dust, and seekers that even wisdom ends in mystery. The prophets who came after him did not surpass his mind, but they carried his heart purified by fire. They spoke less of power and more of repentance, less of gold and more of justice. Their cry, "Return to the Lord," was the echo of the wisdom Solomon had sought at the end of his life. Through them, his sorrow bore fruit, and so his story became eternal, the pattern of ascent and decline, of revelation and regret. Every age that followed repeated it in its own form. When nations grew rich and proud, they saw in his memory their future written. When men of knowledge grew weary of their own brilliance, they turned to his lament and found their reflection. The temple he built no longer stood. its stones scattered by conquerors, yet the lesson it embodied still rose from the ruins, that no house, however grand, can hold the infinite, and no mind, however wise, can command the heart. Sometimes, in later centuries, pilgrims would stand among the fallen stones of Zion at twilight, where the dust of the old temple caught the last light of day. They would look toward the hills and remember the stories of the golden age of the king who spoke with God, who ruled the world in peace, who built a house for the eternal, and who ended his days in silence. They would whisper his words as prayer. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, before the evil days come, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. The wind would pass through the ruins like the breath of memory, carrying his voice across centuries. It spoke not of despair, but of awakening the wisdom that sees beyond vanity into the stillness of eternity. For though his kingdom fell, his understanding rose beyond it, becoming a light not of empire but of the soul. In every age, men and women seeking meaning would open his writings and find themselves reflected there, their hopes, their labours, their regrets. They would see that the story of Solomon was not only the history of a king, but the confession of humanity itself. All of life, he had written, is a chase after wind. Yet to know this is the beginning of peace, and thus the echo of vanity became the whisper of wisdom, that quiet, enduring voice that still speaks beneath the noise of kingdoms and the passing of ages. It reminds the restless heart that all under the sun is fleeting, but the search for truth, the turning of the soul toward the eternal, is the one pursuit that never dies. The sunset of the kingdom, ages passed over the hills of Judah like slow-moving clouds, and time wore down the stones that had once gleamed beneath the feet of Solomon's builders. The golden city became a memory, its brilliance dimmed by centuries of dust and tears. Yet every generation that stood upon the ruins of Zion could still feel, faintly, the echo of that age, the hum of wisdom that had once filled the air like incense, the peace that had once joined heaven and earth in one breath. The temple still stood, though weathered and cracked, its gold longs stripped by foreign hands. The ark within it lay silent beneath the shadow of time. Pilgrims still came, kneeling upon the worn flagstones, whispering the prayers of their fathers, but they no longer prayed for wealth or glory. They prayed for remembrance that the light which once shone in Solomon's day might flicker again, even if only for a moment. The kingdom that had been divided by pride was now divided by history itself. Israel in the north had fallen long ago to Assyrian swords, its tribes scattered to the wind. Judah had endured a little longer, its kings clinging to the walls of Jerusalem like ivy to stone, until Babylon rose like a storm and swept it all away. The temple burned, the city fell, the people were carried eastward in chains. Yet in the exile, amid despair and foreign tongues, the name of Solomon returned not as a king of palaces, but as a teacher of endurance. His words became the voice that kept faith alive when all else was lost. To everything there is a season, they whispered by the rivers of Babylon, a time to break down and a time to build up. And from those words grew a strength that no empire could conquer, the wisdom of surviving the fall. When the exiles returned generations later, their hands calloused and their hearts scarred, they rebuilt the temple not in gold but in humility. They remembered the splendor of Solomon's house, but they no longer sought to match it. They understood now what he had learned too late, that no structure, however perfect, could contain the eternal. Their new temple was smaller, plainer, yet holier in its simplicity. Its strength lay not in its walls but in its faith. As centuries passed, empires came and went, like the tides Solomon once described. Persia, Greece, Rome, each in turn cast its shadow over Jerusalem, and each in turn was swallowed by the same oblivion. Yet through every conquest, every exile, the scrolls of Solomon endured. They were copied in secret, carried across deserts and seas, translated into languages unborn in his time. In monasteries and libraries, From Babylon to Athens, from Cairo to Cordoba, his words found new life. In the dim candlelight of 1,000 scholars' chambers, the ink of his sorrow glowed anew. His lament for vanity became the anthem of those who had lost everything and still believed. His reflections on time became the heartbeat of civilizations rising and falling. He had written that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor riches to the wise, and in every fallen empire, those words rang true. The builders of the world's towers found in him both warning and comfort, that nothing lasts, and therefore all things are precious. And so, as the earth turned, Solomon's kingdom never truly died. It changed form, shedding its gold for parchment, its armies for language, its temples for the living temples of the heart. The wisdom that had once ruled men now ruled thought itself. It crossed oceans, survived fires, and whispered through every century in the cadence of humility. The kings who came after him tried to imitate his glory, but they built without balance, ruled without grace, lived without awe. Their palaces fell, their names faded, but the words of Solomon remained, unshaken. His empire had been bound by peace. His legacy was bound by truth, and truth, unlike gold, does not rust. There came a time when travellers from far lands, Greeks, Persians, Arabs, Romans, stood upon the mount where his temple once rose. They found only broken stones and wind, but even there, among the ruins, they spoke of him. Some called him sage, some prophet, some magician, some fool who had touched the heavens and fallen back to earth. Yet all agreed that his wisdom was eternal, because it told not of power, but of the soul. The sunset of Solomon's kingdom was unlike that of any empire before or since. It did not end in chaos or blood alone, but in revelation. His life became the great parable of mankind, that knowledge without reverence leads to ruin, that wealth without gratitude leads to emptiness, that peace without humility cannot last. Yet his fall was not destruction, it was transformation. The glory of his throne had turned into the quiet immortality of his words. When the last stone of the old temple fell, when centuries of sand covered the bones of kings, the wind still carried his voice through the olive groves and over the deserts. It whispered the truth that every civilization would learn in its turn, that all under the sun is fleeting, but the search for wisdom never dies. And somewhere in eternity, beyond the limits of dust and shadow, the soul of Solomon found its rest. The restless mind that had sought to know all things had at last laid down its questions. The heart that had divided itself among gods and loves had been gathered into wholeness. The voice that once echoed through the halls of marble and cedar now whispered softly through the ages. No longer seeking, only understanding. In the stillness beyond time, he looked upon the pattern of his life and saw it for what it was, not failure, but completion. Every joy and sorrow, every triumph and fall, every word spoken and silence kept had been part of the great design he had once tried to comprehend. He saw that wisdom was not the destination, but the path itself, the endless turning of the soul toward its maker. And in that realization, the King of Israel smiled once more. Not the proud smile of the youth who built temples and palaces, but the gentle smile of the man who, at last, understood why all things must pass. For if nothing faded, nothing could be born anew. Below, the world turned on new empires rising, new songs sung, new seekers walking the same road he once walked. And through them all, his words remained like sunlight scattered upon the dust, reminders of a golden age, warnings of its loss, promises of its return. And so, though his temple fell, his wisdom still built temples in the mind. Though his crown tarnished, his understanding became the crown of all who seek truth. Though his voice grew faint in the noise of centuries, its echo still moves quietly beneath the human heart, the whisper of the wise king reminding the restless world that there is nothing new under the sun, yet everything is holy beneath it, for all things fade, but truth endures. And in that endurance, lies the eternal kingdom. Solomon had sought all his life, not of stone or gold, but of spirit,